Chapter 1998. For such a supreme emperor, even if he was turned into powder, as long as there was a trace of him, he could recover. Even if there was no trace of him, as long as the concept of his own existence still existed, he could be reborn after a certain number of years. However, such a rebirth, because he could not control the concept of existence, would inevitably have some loss. It was difficult to retain the memory intact, and it was more likely that he would become a completely different person. Under such circumstances, even the bones of the man in front of him had not completely decayed. When he stimulated his own hope and completely restrained all kinds of decaying aura, he naturally recovered. After recovering, the man looked at Luo Fan with a face full of expectation and asked, "I wonder what you can teach me?" According to what I think, perhaps, the rule of the road to Tao Master is not that there cannot be two selves in the same time and space. It's that the past cannot be changed. Luo Fan just said. The past cannot be changed. The man looked puzzled at first. But after all, he was also a supreme emperor. Thinking quickly, all kinds of complicated ideas emerged from his heart. Suddenly, he came to a sudden realization and understood what Luo Fan wanted to express. In other words, as long as my past remains unchanged and the self that is born will not be affected by my existence, there won't be any problems? The man's eyes lit up and he said, "That is to say, as long as my past remains unchanged and the self that was born will not be affected by my existence, there won't be any problems? If it is as I think, it should be so," Luo Fan just said lightly. Hearing this, the man looked a little nervous and a little happy. He was a little expectant but also a little nervous. If this was the truth, it would be a great thing for him. Now, although he was extremely concerned about the injury on his heart and was extremely eager to repair it, but his fear of the road to Tao Master. But he had already suppressed this urgent idea. It turned out that the reason why he asked Luo Fan to help him re-enter the road to Tao Master. More importantly, in another 10,000 years, his other self would be born. If he stayed here, he would be completely erased. Now that he heard that there was such a way to prevent himself from existing at the same time with his past self, and that this world would cause him to be erased. In an instant, his fear of the Tao Master's path finally suppressed everything. He would rather stay here to verify Luo Fan's conjecture than go on the path of the Tao Master. It could be said that at this time, even if Luo Fan was willing to spend time to help him become a Tao Master, he definitely wouldn't be willing either. "Thank you, fellow Taoist. With your words, I don't have to challenge the road of Tao Master anymore." His eyes were full of vitality as he spoke. It was as if he had suddenly grasped the last bit of hope in the midst of despair. "That is just my speculation. It could be true, but it could also be false. The way I see it, if you want to be sure, you should find another cultivator to trade with," Luo Fan said coolly. "There's no need for that. It's too dangerous for me to be a Tao Master. With my ability, I am not qualified to challenge the path of Tao Master. If we go there, we will only be able to live a little longer. In comparison, staying in this world will give us a greater chance of survival." The man shook his head. Seeing his expression, Luo Fan didn't try to persuade him anymore. After all, this was his own decision. His choice made no difference to him. He immediately said, "In that case, I won't disturb you any longer. Take care, fellow Taoist." With that, he was about to leave. At this time, the man called out to Luo Fan and said, "Fellow Taoist, please wait. I can't repay you for telling me such a secret. This is a treasure I obtained from the Tao Master's path. I'm willing to give it to fellow Taoist as a reward. I hope fellow Taoist won't think it's too crude and accept a small token of my appreciation." Hearing this, Luo Fan just shook his head lightly and said, "I don't deserve a reward without doing anything. It's just a sentence. It's not worth this treasure." Hearing this, the man was a little ashamed and said, "Well, actually, I have a favor to ask." Hearing this, Luo Fan became curious and asked, "What else?" "In the past, I stepped on the path of Tao Master after 3 trillion years. In other words, I need 3 trillion years to avoid my past self, so that it can't sense my existence. This is really too difficult. With my memory, there are several opportunities in the past to discover my existence. Therefore, I hope that fellow Taoist can teach me a way to completely avoid my other self," the man said. Hearing this, Luo Fan suddenly understood. If this man was born after 10,000 years, then by the time he was qualified to step on the path of Tao Master, it would really take trillions of years. Such a long time spent in the same world with his other selves, and there was such a close spiritual connection between the two selves. It was really very likely that at some time, the two selves would have a connection, and then change the past so that his past self could sense the existence of his future self. At that time, it would obviously be a disaster for this man. I do have a way to completely change your nature, so that you can completely cut off the connection between you and your past self. As long as you don't appear in front of it, it will be very difficult for it to find you. However, I'm afraid this will affect your cultivation. If so, are you still willing to do it?" Luo Fan said lightly. Hearing this, the man said nervously, "How much will it affect my cultivation? Will it make me lose all my cultivation?" Luo Fan shook his head lightly and said, "It will only affect the improvement of your cultivation in the future, but it won't change much for your current cultivation." Hearing this, the man was instantly completely relieved. For the current him, with the burden of that rotten heart, no matter what, he had no intention of improving again. Under such circumstances, not to mention that it would only affect the improvement of his cultivation in the future. Even if it completely cut off his path of improvement, he would not hesitate to agree. At that moment, he directly nodded and said, "It doesn't matter. As long as I can maintain my current cultivation, I can do whatever I want. I hope that you can help me. I am willing to thank you with this item." Luo Fan did not refuse. With a thought, he casually waved his hand, and the piece of metal that could even affect the surrounding laws fell into his hand. This piece of metal was unexpectedly heavy. It felt like a part of the world was pressing down on his hand. At this moment, he felt that the laws around him were beginning to be controlled by the piece of metal in his hand. He even felt that he could use this piece of metal to control the surrounding laws. However, controlling this piece of metal seemed to be even more difficult than directly controlling the surrounding laws, and there were even more obstacles. At this moment, Luo Fan could not help but exclaim, "What a treasure!" Although he had yet to completely comprehend the profoundness of this metal block, just the sensation he had was enough to let him understand that this metal block was extraordinary. It was even stronger than before he had come into contact with it. When he saw Luo Fan holding the piece of metal, there was a hint of reluctance in the man's eyes, but in the end, he was completely suppressed by his desire to live. Compared to his own life, so what if this treasure was good? Luo Fan kept the treasure and said, "I'm ready to make a move. Are you ready?" "I'm ready." The man's expression turned solemn at this moment. Hearing this, Luo Fan did not hesitate anymore. He raised his hand and pointed at the man. In an instant, the power of laws instantly seeped into the man's body, inside and out. It wrapped around the man from top to bottom, causing the man's entire body to be under his complete control in an instant. At this moment, the man finally felt how powerful Luo Fan was. He had only encountered this kind of power in the path of Tao Master. It was as if any world was just a small pond in front of such a terrifying existence. As long as he wanted to, he could completely overturn everything with just a raise of his hand or a kick. At this moment, he felt a lingering fear. He had actually addressed such a terrifying existence as fellow Taoist? Amidst this lingering fear, he felt inexplicably proud. At least his choice was right. This person was really the powerhouse that was most likely to help him, All sorts of complicated thoughts flashed through his mind at this moment. However, there was no way for him to change his appearance. Everything about his body was completely out of his control. At this moment, the power of laws that Luo Fan poured into the man's body began to gradually changing the many details of the man's body. This change contained the law of decomposition and transformation. It turned out that Luo Fan began to use the law of decomposition and transformation to change the man's entire body, inside and out, and even the deepest essence, causing the man's essence to gradually be decomposed and transformed into another form, gradually distinguishing him from his original form. This kind of change went deep into the essence. Even if it was Luo Fan who was controlling it, it would not be easy to end it. As a result, time slowly passed. Gradually, several days passed in the blink of an eye. During these few days, a powerful aura faintly appeared in this valley. It constantly trembled and formed a powerful deterrent to all living beings in this area. This caused the powerhouses that originally existed in this area to avoid this valley. They did not even dare to extend their senses over here. However, any living being that knew about the changes in this valley clearly knew that there was definitely an extremely powerful powerhouse that was using some sort of method here. For a time, everyone's hearts were filled with panic, and they faintly felt an indescribable worry. They were worried that the changes here would affect their survival here, and it would affect their authority here. After living in fear for several days, the powerful aura was released and withdrawn. The sea of clouds in the sky was instantly torn open by this powerful aura. Countless living beings of the Cloud Dragon clan in the sea of clouds began to hide in all directions. In the blink of an eye, the sea of clouds within a radius of hundreds of thousands of kilometers had completely disappeared. Ha ha ha. I finally have nothing to worry about anymore. Ha 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 ha. At this moment, a loud laughter rose into the sky from the valley. This laughter. All the living beings in the surroundings were shocked. They had never heard this voice before. In fact, there were no living beings in their memories. Any powerhouse's voice could match any detail of this voice. It was as if this was a voice that adjusted itself according to their memories, causing it to sound completely different from any other voice in their memories. What method is this? Why is there such a change? Those living beings that could survive in this area were naturally all powerhouses. At this moment, they instantly sensed the uniqueness of this voice. Their expressions changed drastically. They felt as if their worldview had been overturned. However, no matter how shocked they were, they did not dare to go to the valley to understand. Because the powerful aura just now was enough to crush all of them. It could even be said that just the aura itself was enough to take away more than half of their lives. Under such circumstances, unless one was truly tired of living, it was absolutely impossible for any living being to come here and try their luck. At this moment, in the valley, the man in front of Luo Fan had completely changed his appearance. Whether it was his appearance or his aura, his voice and aura were in an indescribable state, a state that was constantly changing. A state that was constantly changing. And no matter what appearance or state he changed into, it was a state that was completely different from the memories of those who were watching and sensing it. Looks like the effect is quite good. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and he looked quite satisfied. This was the change he had towards the man. One must know that the reason why two selves could sense each other was because the two selves were essentially one. In the same world, there would naturally be a resonance that was difficult to cut off. In fact, it was not just in the same world, even in different worlds that were in a state of chaos, this resonance would be difficult to completely sever. In other words, there was only one way to sever this resonance, and that was to completely change the essence of one's self into a completely different appearance. However, this would cause another problem, and that was, a complete change to the essence of one's self would naturally affect the integrity of the other party's entire self, causing the other party to no longer be themselves. Clearly, this side effect was unacceptable for any living being. Therefore, no matter how Luo Fan thought about it, this was the only way to directly bestow this man in front of him with a completely unfamiliar ability that could be sensed by other living beings. With this ability, even if this living being from the past appeared in front of him, it would only feel that this man was a complete stranger, and would not think that this was his future self. Directly bestowing this ability to a living being was clearly impossible with Luo Fan's ability alone. However, it was clearly different with the laws of decomposition and transformation. With the laws of decomposition and transformation, Luo Fan could even easily change the laws of this world and fuse the essence of this man in front of him with the laws of the world to a certain extent. What was the big deal about bestowing the laws that this ability represented to this man? In fact, if Luo Fan was willing now, he could even fuse any living being with any kind of ability in this world, allowing that living being to possess any seemingly mysterious ability. This even included the ability to easily wipe out a false sage with a mortal's body. However, he had never thought of adding such an ability to himself. The reason was naturally not that he looked down on these abilities. In fact, there were many abilities that he was extremely tempted by. The fundamental reason why he did not do this was that this method seemed to give a living being a powerful ability, but in fact, it almost cut off the path of improvement in the future. Fusing oneself with the laws of the world was equivalent to becoming a part of the laws of the world. In order to improve, apart from having to comprehend more mysteries and increase one's cultivation realm, there was a more important point, and that was to improve the laws represented by the ability that he fused with. It went without saying how difficult it was. It had to be known that the laws of the world itself represented a certain limit. Even in a state of chaos, it was extremely difficult to affect these laws. It was simply a pipe dream for a cultivator to try and improve the laws. In other words, once one fused with the laws of the world, it was equivalent to cutting off the path of improvement in one's cultivation. From now on, if one wanted to improve even a little bit, they would need to put in tens of millions of times more effort than before to have a chance of achieving it. This was the fundamental reason why Luo Fan had never used this ability on himself, even though he clearly had it. This was also the fundamental reason why he asked the man to consider it carefully just now. At this moment, the man also sensed this drawback. Although he was still smiling, it was still a little less than before. After all, he was a cultivator. Even if he had completely cut off the thought of continuing to improve, he still had a trace of hope in his heart. Now that this hope had finally been completely cut off, telling him that this hope could no longer come true, how could his mood not be affected at all? Many thanks, fellow. After a long while, the man let out a sigh and bowed to Luo Fan. Luo Fan looked at him and only smiled faintly. I hope you won't blame me in the future. Chapter 1999. After leaving the valley, Luo Fan had completely forgotten about that man. With the help of the mysteries of decomposing and transforming the laws, he was able to continuously change the laws of this world according to his will. In just a few breaths, he had already traversed an almost infinite distance and arrived at the chaotic region. Along the way, many cultivators had discovered his presence. In fact, Luo Fan could even sense numerous gazes directed at him. However, even after he had arrived, not a single cultivator had made a move against him. The reason for this was very simple. It was none other than his direct and decisive method of manipulating the laws of this world. It was simply too frightening. After all, this was a huge world. If one wanted to manipulate the laws of this world, they would at least need to spend countless years to experience and comprehend it. Furthermore, one's strength would also need to reach an unimaginable level in order to be able to do so. Moreover, even if one had the ability to manipulate the laws of this world, they would need to prepare for a long time before they could do so. In fact, they might even need to rely on some mysterious formations or mystical abilities to do so. Who would be able to do it as casually as Luo Fan? In the eyes of these cultivators, An existence that could manipulate the laws of this world so casually either possessed strength that was unimaginable to them. Either that, or he had a powerful magic treasure or an astonishing background. Regardless of the reason, powerful cultivators would not be willing to offend such a person unless it was absolutely necessary. It was precisely because of this that he was able to smoothly traverse such a long distance in such a short time and arrive at this location. As he approached the chaotic region, even Luo Fan could not help but feel nervous. Although he had already used various methods to completely conceal himself and did his best to prevent his past self from resonating with his current self, he still did not have absolute confidence that he could completely cut off this resonance. Moreover, if even the slightest problem occurred, it would be a disaster for him. Under such circumstances, how could he not feel nervous? Due to this nervousness, his speed became even faster. Originally, it would have taken him a few breaths to reach the Heaven Cave Peak. However, with his full strength, he had traversed an endless distance in an instant and arrived at the Heaven Cave Peak, arriving at the region where the world had reversed. In the blink of an eye, he arrived at the Heaven Cave Peak. Once again, he saw the ancient trees. "You have my leaves on you." At this moment, a voice that Luo Fan was extremely familiar with rang out from the group of ancient trees. At this moment, the voice was a little confused and a little enlightened. It seemed to be puzzled that Luo Fan actually had its leaves on him. Suddenly, he had already vaguely guessed the reason behind it. When Luo Fan saw the ancient tree, he sighed and said, "This is what the future you gave me." As he spoke, he took out the leaf. At this moment, the leaf was constantly emitting mysterious waves that resonated with the ancient tree in front of him, causing it to tremble slightly. After a while, Gumu smiled and said, "I see. I didn't expect you to become a Tao master after 30 million years. We are really fated. Many thanks for giving me this leaf, fellow Taoist. If it wasn't for this leaf, I wouldn't have been able to discover my location so quickly." Luo Fan said gratefully, "Haha, this is just a small matter. If it wasn't for your actions in the future, I wouldn't have given you this leaf in the future." Gumu chuckled and said nonchalantly. When Luo Fan heard this, he just smiled and casually imprinted some of what he had seen on the Tao Master's path onto the leaf. Then, he sent it to the ancient tree. The ancient tree took the leaf. Even the leaf itself began to emit light. Indistinctly, there seemed to be some kind of mysterious information flowing between the ancient tree and the leaf. After a while, the various changes disappeared. Gumu said, "Thank you, fellow Taoist, for giving me such precious information. With this information, I might have a chance to challenge the Tao Master's path in the future." Luo Fan just faintly smiled, expressing his gratitude to him. After that, he didn't stay any longer. He turned around and rushed into the Heaven Cave. In the blink of an eye, he was already on the Tao Master's path. For him, with the hidden danger of the resonance between his past and present selves, it was already a luxury to be able to stay here and talk to the ancient tree for a while. How could he stay here for too long? As for why he had left his own insights on the Tao Master's path to the ancient tree, it was not entirely to thank the ancient tree for its help. It was also to protect the integrity of his past. If he didn't express his gratitude to the ancient tree, and if the ancient tree held a grudge against him when his past self came here in the future, wouldn't the situation be terrible? Perhaps at that time, he wouldn't be affected by the Tao Master's path. Changing his past would not make any difference to him. But what if it did? If it did, wouldn't his life be in danger because of such a small matter? Naturally, he couldn't do such a thing. After stepping onto the Tao Master's path, what he saw was completely different from what he had seen before. At this time, he had already stepped into a strange passageway. This passageway was extremely bright and dazzling. Looking back, it was no longer the pitch-black entrance of Heaven Cave Peak. Instead, it was the entrance of countless forks. In other words, this time, when he stepped onto the Tao Master's path again, He had directly surpassed the original long road at the beginning. He had directly set out from the fork in the road, and he had directly chosen the most correct fork and began to move forward, so, these forks have to be broken through in this way. An indescribable understanding emerged in his heart at this time. With this understanding, an inexplicable smile appeared on his face. His figure continued to accelerate, and under the cover of the unique space-time dimension that belonged to him, he continued to move towards the end of the road. In the process of moving forward, time gradually passed. At least, in Luo Fan's perception, time was passing by when he needed to pee. Hundreds of years later, the passageway was completely shrouded in light. The incomparably strong light almost completely suppressed the passageway, causing the entire passageway to be covered in light. At this time, even Luo Fan could only see the endless light in front of his eyes. If he wanted to choose a direction, he could only rely on analyzing the strength of the countless light rays. In fact, there were even many things that could only be determined by guessing on this day. An indescribable feeling emerged in Luo Fan's heart. In front of him, this was his destination. With this feeling, an inexplicable expectation arose in his heart. After rushing in this passageway for such a long time, he was finally going to reach the end. Just as this feeling was born, he felt that he had broken through a strange barrier. In an instant, the light around him suddenly converged, and he had already arrived in an indescribable world. This world was extremely mysterious, and the nomological laws in it were almost on the same level as the great heaven and earth. However, the nomological laws in it were extremely strange, allowing him to easily understand and master them. At a glance, the entire world looked like a boundless starry sky of the universe. However, it wasn't stars that were floating in the starry sky, but cities. Some were broken, some were complete, some were majestic, and some were small. These cities floated in the void, as if there was some kind of power controlling them to constantly move around the entire world according to a special rule. It also seemed that they were just floating randomly. This is the Tao Master's path? Such doubts arose in Luo Fan's heart. In fact, there was no need for him to doubt this at all. The moment he stepped into this world, he had already instinctively known it. This was the real Tao Master's path. This kind of instinct was extremely strange and mysterious, and he clearly knew it. This was not an instinct born out of nowhere, but the Tao Master's path in this world was telling him this. The reason why he had such doubts at this time was also very simple. Because the situation of the Tao Master's path was essentially different from what he had imagined. The Tao Master's path, the Tao Master's path. Even if he did not think that this was a performance of a long and continuous road, in his imagination, there should be some characteristics of a road. Now, it was actually such a vast void, and it seemed that a void had experienced a great battle. How could he not be suspicious of this? With a thought, he took a step forward and easily arrived above a dilapidated city with the help of the rules and laws of this void. Although the level and complexity of the laws of this world were similar to the laws of this world, due to their unique composition, the laws of this world were not much different from the laws of this world that he had created. In fact, he did not even need to use much strength to control them. He raised his hand and made a grabbing motion in the air, and powerful laws of the great world wrapped around the city. Then, he manipulated these laws of the great world to compress the broken city. If it was any other city, the city definitely wouldn't be able to resist his actions at all. It would definitely be compressed to the size that he wanted it to be. However, it was obvious that this was not an ordinary city. Even if it was already broken, he could clearly sense how powerful it was when it was complete and how high its essence was. He manipulated the laws of the great world to compress it, but in the end, there was no way to compress the broken city at all. He felt powerless like an ant trying to shake a tree. What a powerful city! At this time, Luo Fan was secretly shocked. Even though he hadn't unleashed his full strength, His strength was normally sufficient to easily obliterate a universe. However, he wasn't even able to shake this broken city, so it was self-evident how powerful this city was. "Fellow Taoist, you're new here, right?" A voice resounded from afar. The voice wasn't transmitted directly, but it was transmitted through the laws of the Great World, so Luo Fan was able to determine the location of the speaker. He turned to look at the broken city in the distance, and there was a woman standing there and looking at him from afar with a smile on her face. That dilapidated city was billions of miles away from here. Normally speaking, not to mention sound, even light would take a long time to reach this place. But at this moment, Lin Yun's eyes widened in shock. But now, the woman was looking at Luo Fan, and Luo Fan was looking at the woman as if they were standing opposite each other. "It seems that I did something stupid just now." Luo Fan just smiled. He said. As he spoke, he stopped manipulating the laws of the great world around the broken city and let them dissipate naturally. The woman smiled slightly and said, "It's not really stupid. In fact, any fellow Taoist who has just stepped onto the path of Tao Master would do this. I've done the same thing before." This woman couldn't be considered to be peerlessly beautiful, and her appearance could only be considered to be delicate and pretty. However, there was an indescribable heroic spirit between her brows, causing her to seem like a sharp sword that revealed an indescribable charm, causing others to involuntarily overlook her appearance that couldn't be considered to be peerlessly beautiful. The woman's cultivation wasn't too strong, but it had already surpassed the Supreme Emperor realm. Compared to the man that Luo Fan had encountered before, she was much stronger. "If fellow Taoist doesn't mind, can you come and sit here? I've been here for countless years, but I don't know how the outside world is. I wonder if fellow Taoist can tell me about it?" The woman continued. Naturally, Luo Fan couldn't ask for more. No matter how strong or weak the woman was, she was, after all, a wily old fox on the path of Tao Master. Her understanding of the path of Tao Master must be much deeper than his. If he could learn more about the path of Tao Master from her, it would naturally be a great thing. At this moment, he naturally agreed with a smile. In the blink of an eye, he had already arrived at the broken city where the woman was. This was obviously not the woman's residence. It seemed to be a temporary place for the woman to stay. She didn't even open up a cave residence. She just casually flattened a place and casually remodeled it. After the two met, Luo Fan exchanged names with the woman. The woman's name matched her temperament very well. Her name was Jianlan. When Jianlan saw Luo Fan, the first thing she asked was about the outside world. Although Luo Fan didn't wander in the great Tao Master world for long, he had after all obtained the memory of the city lord of Hungry Wolf City. After all, he still knew most of the common sense. Therefore, he was able to answer most of the questions that Jianlan wanted to know. It made her sigh at the great changes in the world, and at the same time, her heart surged with waves of satisfaction. After satisfying Jianlan's thirst for knowledge, Luo Fan also asked about the path of Tao Master. Through Jianlan's explanation, he knew that this world was only an insignificant part of the path of Tao Master. In fact, such a world was endless in the path of Tao Master. It was said that since ancient times, no expert had discovered all the worlds. Even the Tao Masters who had once walked out of the path of Tao Master were the same. Of course, although there were countless worlds like this, not all of them looked like this. Other heavens and earths also looked very ordinary, just like ordinary heavens and earths. There were also heavens and earths that were countless times stranger than this heavens and earth. Almost as long as you wanted it, you could find it. The reason why this world looked like this did not seem to have been like this from the beginning. It was said that countless years ago, this world seemed to be the headquarters of a certain force. It was once a center where cultivators gathered and became the cultivation holy land that many cultivators dreamed of. However, at some point, a great battle broke out in this world. In the end, everything in this world was destroyed, causing this world to become countless times worse than other worlds. This caused this world to be abandoned by many cultivators, and from then on, it became a place for cultivators to scavenge. At this point, Jianlan's face was full of emotion, and there was even a faint trace of fear. Luo Fan was also secretly shocked by this. After all, just by probing the ruined city, he could already see how powerful the existence that could create such a city was. Such a powerful existence, and even a complete force, was destroyed in the end, leaving only these ruins. The number of experts on the Tao Master's path far exceeded his imagination. How are the forces on the Tao Master's path now? Luo Fan finally asked the most important question. In the past, there were forces that ruled over a region, and naturally, there would not be any changes now. There must be many forces. These were obviously the most important things to him right now. Hearing this, Jianlan smiled and said, "If it's the big forces, there are 3,000 Tao Masters alone. They are at the top of the Tao Master's path and occupy almost 90% of the resources on the Tao Master's path. However, this has nothing to do with us independent cultivators. The 3,000 forces play by themselves, and we independent cultivators are just ants to them. They don't care about us at all. Therefore, as long as you don't actively seek death, you generally don't need to care about them. Below these 3,000 big forces, there are hundreds of thousands of small forces formed by independent cultivators. This is what we need to pay attention to." At this point, Jianlan's expression became a little serious. Chapter 2000. According to Jianlan, the surrounding several thousand places were controlled by a force called the Sword King Alliance. Although the Sword King Alliance was mediocre among the hundreds of thousands of independent cultivator forces, it was a colossus for independent cultivators like them who had no one to rely on. It was said that the Alliance Master of the Sword King Alliance was an expert whose strength had reached an unfathomable level and could leave the path of a Tao Master at any time. If such an expert really wanted to attack Jianlan, he might be able to crush her with a single finger. Jianlan's eyes were filled with fear and longing when she spoke of this. The Sword King Alliance? Does the Alliance Master walk the sword principle? Luo Fan asked. I don't know about that. However, most of the cultivators in the Sword King Alliance walk the sword principle. Actually, I came here to see if I have a chance to join the Sword King Alliance. Jianlan smiled. She didn't seem embarrassed at all when she spoke of this, and her open-mindedness left a good impression on Luo Fan. With your strength, is the Sword King Alliance not interested in you? The requirements of the Sword King Alliance are too high. He wasn't flattering her. Although Jianlan's strength was far inferior to his, she was faintly an existence that surpassed the Supreme Emperor realm. If such a powerful existence was in the outside world, even if it was in the Great World, it would be enough to rule over a region of the world. Even a force established by a Tao Master couldn't ignore such an existence. How could the Sword King Alliance refuse such a talent? Jianlan smiled bitterly when she heard this and said, "It's not that they don't want me. In fact, the Sword King Alliance was quite enthusiastic when I wanted to join. However, in the end I changed my mind." Why is that? Is there something wrong with the Sword King Alliance? Luo Fan was even more curious. One must know that the Sword Orchid had come to this area for the sake of joining the Sword King Union. Now, the Sword King Alliance invited her enthusiastically, but she refused. How could he not be curious? It's just some private matters. It's meaningless to talk about it. Jianlan didn't explain much and just said so. She and Luo Fan had only met for the first time. Although the communication was quite pleasant, and both of them had obtained a lot of information they wanted to know from each other, that was all. Their friendship was still ordinary. She naturally couldn't explain this kind of sensitive question to Luo Fan too clearly. In fact, for her to be able to say this much, she could already be considered to be cheerful and generous, appearing to be extremely familiar with him. Luo Fan wasn't someone who didn't know what was good for him. Seeing that she wasn't willing to say more, he didn't ask any further and began to ask about the other forces. Jian Lan took the opportunity to talk about the other forces around them. In fact, aside from the Sword King Alliance, there were dozens of other forces in the surroundings. These forces were on par with the Sword King Alliance. One of them was called the Divine Blade Sect, which was completely hostile to the Sword King Alliance. They were practically irreconcilable enemies. Once they met, they would fight to the death. As for regional affairs, I'll definitely oppose whatever you approve of. I'll definitely agree with whatever you oppose. In her words, Jian Lan warned Luo Fan in an extremely serious manner that if he encountered the members of the Sword King Alliance and the Divine Blade Sect at the same time, he should hide as far away as he could and hide as secretly as possible. He would rather be a coward than stand out. Otherwise, once the fire burned him, he wouldn't be able to put it out no matter how hard he tried. At the end of her words, Jian Lan talked about the strength levels of the Tao Master Path. Because the experts who entered the Tao Master Path, they had almost reached the end of the path of cultivation in the outside world. Therefore, the strength levels of the outside world were no longer suitable here. After countless years of development, the strength levels of the outside world were no longer suitable here. The strength levels were divided by tribulations. There was no absolute strict standard for each level. Generally speaking, if one could pass the first level of the Tao Master Path and step into the second level, he would be considered to have passed the first tribulation and be considered a second tribulation expert. If one could pass the second level and step into the third level, he would be considered a three-tribulation expert. As for those who had not passed the first level of the Tao Master's Path, they were collectively known as the one-tribulation experts, just like them, who were only at the first level. Hearing this, Luo Fan was secretly shocked. This division of strength was very similar to the division of his own strength. According to his current classification of his strength, he had now passed through the third tribulation and had just sensed the existence of the fourth tribulation. But he thought that he was a practitioner who had passed through the third tribulation. He did not know what was the difference between this and the classification of strength in the path of Tao Master. I wonder who was the first to make this division of strength? And how many levels are there in total? Luo Fan hurriedly asked. I don't know. I don't know when this division of strength came into being. As for the levels, it is said that there are 9 levels in total. It seems that those who have passed the 9th major tribulation are Tao Masters. However, this is just a rumor. I have never seen an expert who has passed the 3rd major tribulation. Jian Lan said. Hearing this, Luo Fan could only sigh inwardly, obviously not satisfied with this answer. How can I break through this level of the Tao Master Path and step into the next level? Luo Fan asked. This is very simple. It is said that as long as you pass through 129,600 square worlds, you will be able to sense the entrance to the second level of the Tao Master Path. At that time, you will be able to break through the barrier of the entrance and step into the second level of the Tao Master Path. Jian Lan said without hesitation. Obviously, this was a kind of common sense for the cultivators on the Tao Master Path pass through 129,600 square worlds? Luo Fan secretly pondered. It was obviously impossible to just step into a certain world and then leave after passing through it. It was necessary to thoroughly comprehend something in this world and break through some sort of barrier. Only then could one be considered to have passed through it. He raised his eyes and looked around. He could vaguely sense that there was an indescribable barrier behind the incomparably lively laws that had already reached the level of the world. This barrier was connected with all the laws of heaven and earth. It was also connected with all space-time, all matter, and all energy in this world. It was like a transit point for everything. In an instant, he understood in his heart that the barrier he had to break through must be this barrier. His heart slightly moved, he casually grabbed The surrounding laws of heaven and earth naturally repelled it, revealing a layer of dark shadow. This layer of shadow was extremely mysterious. Although it was only a shadow, it appeared extremely tough and powerful, as if it was the most existential thing in the world. It seemed that even if he used all his strength, it could not be broken. As long as I break this barrier, I will be considered to have passed through this world, right? Luo Fan stroked the shadow. He said to Jianlan. At this time, Jianlan was already staring at him in shock. This layer of barrier was called the Barrier of Laws by the cultivators on the path of Tao Master. It was the most fundamental barrier of the world. Only by controlling all the laws of the world could one discover the existence of the Barrier of the Laws. However, one could only discover the existence of the Barrier of the Laws. If one wanted to come into contact with the Barrier of the Laws, one needed to have a deep understanding of all spacetime, all matter, and all energy in the world. It was even to the extent that one had to be able to control all of it. Only then would it be possible. It was precisely because of this that ordinary cultivators wanted to pass through a world. It would take hundreds of millions of years to barely achieve it. After that, he would need to spend a long time recuperating before he could fully recover. She did not expect that the cultivator in front of her, whom she had befriended on a whim, could so easily catch this layer of the Barrier of Laws in front of her. This kind of strength, this kind of method had far exceeded the limits of her imagination, and had even completely subverted her worldview. Yes, it is this layer of the Barrier of Laws, she said with some difficulty. At this time, the way she looked at Luo Fan had completely changed. Originally, she looked at him as an equal, but now she looked at him with admiration. Seeing this, Luo Fan knew that he had gone a little overboard. However, since he had already done it, he did not regret it. He just smiled and said, "Barrier of Laws? Although it is a little one-sided. But it is also reasonable. This name is just a summary of some cultivators. In fact, what is the name of this barrier? No one knows." At this time, Jianlan had already recovered a little. At least on the surface, she had regained her calm. She did not show the shock she had before. In the face of such a situation, Luo Fan just smiled and said, 129,600 square worlds, huh? That's quite a big project. As he spoke, there was an inexplicable look of expectation on his face. In his own mind, he could definitely break this layer of barrier easily and break through this world. However, he had no intention of breaking this layer of barrier immediately. After all, he did not come to the Tao Master Path for the glory of breaking through a number of levels, but for the real harvest. Even if he could not become a true sage, at least he wanted to make great progress in his cultivation realm. Under such circumstances, he should understand the intention of the true sages in setting the first level of the Tao Master Path in such a way, and gain enough through this. This was what he should do. Therefore, at this time, he just smiled faintly, bowed to Jianlan, expressed his gratitude, and then left. Jianlan stretched out her hand as if she wanted to say something, but in the end she sighed and did not speak. After leaving the dilapidated city where Jianlan resided, Luo Fan's heart moved and he moved towards the place where the law of laws was the most concentrated in this part of the world. The world was not a completely uniform existence. Its own law of laws determined that the law of laws would be more concentrated in some places, and thinner in others. Just like in the Tao Master Great World, there were many places where the law of laws were almost completely exposed, allowing cultivators with some cultivation to easily comprehend the numerous laws of laws. For Luo Fan, who wanted to comprehend the law of laws of heaven and earth, to comprehend the space-time, matter, and energy of the world, the place where the law of laws was concentrated was obviously the most beneficial existence for him. It was enough to greatly reduce the time he needed to comprehend everything, and even reduce his consumption. For Luo Fan, who could control the law of laws of heaven and earth at will, It was only a matter of a thought for him to travel to any place in this world. In just a short moment, he had already traversed hundreds of millions of light years, and directly arrived at the most dilapidated place in this part of the world. This place was clearly the most majestic city in the world. But, at this time, the city had already been destroyed, becoming the most dilapidated place in this part of the world. In this place, the fragments of the city spread out. Some even occupied a radius of dozens of light years. Moreover, not a single fragment of the city was more than 10 feet in size. At a glance, the area within a radius of several dozen light years seemed to have transformed into a floating sea of sand. How big was the scale of the war back then? Looking at the vast sea of sand, Luo Fan could not help but be shocked by the power of the force that built this part of the world. With a thought, he raised his hand and made a grabbing motion. Not far away, a stone several feet in size floated in front of him. At first glance, the stone looked no different from an ordinary brick, but upon closer inspection, one would find that there were traces of broken laws of laws within it. These broken laws of laws permeated every inch of the brick, and faintly resonated with the surrounding laws of laws. There was even an inexplicable connection with an even more mysterious and extensive existence, and it was an indescribable blessing. Perhaps it was because of this that even if he wanted to destroy the brick, he would need to expend a lot of energy. After sensing the brick, Luo Fan no longer hesitated. With a thought, he raised his hand and slapped the brick. In an instant, the brick completely collapsed with a bang, turning into a cloud of smoke that continuously surged in front of his palm. Following that, Luo Fan did not stop. Instead, he continued to grab at the surrounding bricks, grabbing them and smashing them. Not long after, the brick fragments in front of him had already piled up to a radius of dozens of feet, and they constantly surged like real fog. After measuring the volume, it was probably enough for his plan. With a thought, he raised his hand and made a grabbing motion. Under his will, the surrounding smoke quickly began to condense, gradually condensing into a statue in front of him. One of them was lifelike and lifelike. It was like a statue of a real person lying there. It was the statue of the cultivator he had met in the projection of the Tao Master's prison. Back then, the cultivator made a deal with him. The cultivator told him how to break through the projection of the Tao Master's prison, and after he truly entered the Tao Master's path, he established an image for the cultivator so that he could use the connection between them to transcend the Tao Master's prison and escape. Since he had already made a promise, Luo Fan naturally had no intention of breaking it. Now that he had the time, he naturally fulfilled the promise. Just as the statue was completely established, an extremely secretive connection suddenly appeared out of nowhere and connected to the statue. With the existence of this connection, the statue suddenly became different from before, as if some kind of indescribable vitality began to appear on the statue. However, it was obvious that although the change had already appeared, the subsequent development was quite slow. It would take an extremely long time for it to grow to the point where it could become a real living being. As the vitality continued to grow, the statue began to resonate with the surrounding spacetime. Vaguely, various laws began to surge in the surroundings. In the end, strands of laws gradually fused with the statue, causing various laws to naturally be born within the statue. The laws that were born were naturally different from the laws that originally existed within the brick. The laws and principles within the bricks had already become broken after the battle. They were strands and bits and pieces, and they didn't form a system at all. However, the laws and principles produced within the sculpture were absolutely complete. Such a difference made the statue much sturdier and harder to damage than the bricks. Moreover, the interweaving of these laws was not random, but vaguely formed a strange system, as if they were forming some kind of Tao through a special method. Luo Fan looked at the statue for a while and smiled. "I've already fulfilled my promise. What happens next is up to you." The statue suddenly flickered with a faint light, as if it was thanking him. Seeing this, Luo Fan no longer hesitated. He turned around and headed towards the center of the sea of sand. At this moment, the statue trembled slightly and began to become more and more illusory. Not long after, it completely disappeared, and all traces of it were hidden in the void. The Tao Sovereign Path had gathered countless cultivators from ancient times to the present, and even from now on. Even if this was only the first level, the number of cultivators had reached an indescribable level. Under such circumstances, even if this world was only a remote one among the countless worlds on the road to becoming a Tao Master, it was impossible for there to be no cultivators exploring it. Just like at this moment, Luo Fan could sense that there were tens of thousands of cultivators in this world. It was just that because the world was vast, it seemed extremely empty when they were spread out. Chapter 2001. After leaving the sculpture, Luo Fan quickly put it to the back of his mind. To him, it was just an interlude. There were more important things waiting for him to do. In a flash, Luo Fan had already arrived at the center of the sea of sand, which was also the place where the laws were the densest and the most tangled in the entire world. The moment he arrived, he felt as if he had fallen into the bottom of the sea. An inexplicable pressure constantly came from all around and pressed on his body, making him feel that his every move required more power than usual. Although this was nothing to him, it also meant that this place was extraordinary. The laws of this world are at the level of the great world, but they can allow cultivators to comprehend them at will. Comprehending the laws of this world is obviously equivalent to comprehending the laws of the great world. In this case, for any cultivator, it will certainly have great benefit. Sensing the countless laws around him, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. Even though it was only the first level of the Tao Sovereign's path, there was already such a mysterious world. The Tao Sovereign's path was indeed worthy of being a cultivation holy land that was specially created to cultivate true saints. It could be said that this world alone was already more powerful than any of the cultivation holy lands in the universe. If a cultivator cultivated in such a world from the beginning, he would definitely be able to become a false saint or even a supreme emperor countless times faster than the outside world. Thinking of this, he also understood why the cultivators who entered the Tao Master's path would stay on the Tao Master's path, even if they had to bear the oppression of countless forces, even if the Tao Master's path was millions of times less dignified than the outside world, they were still unwilling to leave. In such a wonderful cultivation environment, even if they did nothing, just by staying here, the speed of their cultivation would probably not be comparable to fighting to the death in the outside world. Various thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind. He began to carefully comprehend the laws of this world that were revealed in this location. He also comprehended the interactions between these laws and the four basic existences of time, space, matter, and energy, and experienced all kinds of mysterious mysteries. The laws of the great world were all-encompassing, and could even be divided into countless perfect laws of the world. The mysteries contained in them were self-evident. Even if it was Luo Fan, it would not be possible to completely comprehend the laws of this world in a short period of time. However, it was obvious. For Luo Fan, it was not necessary to completely comprehend the laws of this world. The more he improved, the more he understood the vastness of the way of cultivation, and the more he understood that he should make choices in his cultivation. Not to mention anything else, the laws of the great world contained countless perfect laws of the great world. In such a vast and limitless law, there must be profound mysteries that even a true divine would need to carefully understand. It contained all sorts of mysterious principles that even a true divine might not be able to understand. In such a situation, how could an existence like Luo Fan, who had not become a true saint, fully understand them? This was also the fundamental reason why he could not understand the laws of the real great world. And now, because of the mysteries of the Tao Master, although the laws of this world were at the level of the great world, they did not reject cultivators to comprehend them. But it just did not reject them. Perhaps, in theory, any cultivator could finally completely comprehend the laws of this world, but that was only in theory. Honestly speaking, if a cultivator stubbornly wanted to completely comprehend all the laws of this world, then the most likely outcome would be that he would need to spend at least hundreds of trillions of years just to have a chance of doing so. Even if he had the strength of a third tribulation like Luo Fan, it would still be impossible to change that. Although Luo Fan did not carefully consider these, but he also knew that the laws of this world were so vast. Among them, he could understand and perfect the world view for himself. The improvement of his cultivation realm was definitely only a very small part of it. In the center of this sea of sand, Luo Fan sat cross-legged. With a slight thought, the decomposition and transformation law began to emerge, and the parameters began to flow into the decomposition and transformation law. These parameters were none other than the many parameters of his world view of laws. After spending so many hundreds of millions of years to comprehend, he had already extracted the various parameters of the world of laws. At this time, he did not need to spend much time to re-extract them. He only needed to input them again. Input the parameters into the decomposition and transformation law was already an almost instinctive process for Luo Fan. His speed naturally became faster and faster. In just a short 10 years, he had already input many credible parameters of the world of laws into the decomposition and transformation law. Compared to before, this speed was already many times faster. As the last parameter was inputted into the decomposition and transformation law, the laws around Luo Fan's body began to surge rapidly and frantically change. Gradually, the laws around Luo Fan were transformed into an extremely broken state, but it was extremely compatible with Luo Fan. The law of decomposition and transformation could even decompose and transform the laws of the real world. Although the laws of this world were different from the laws of the real world, they did not reject the laws of decomposition and transformation due to their characteristic of not rejecting cultivators' comprehension and transformation. Under the transformation, the laws of this world changed at an unimaginable speed, and the range of the laws of decomposition and transformation continued to expand. In just a few dozen breaths of time, the laws of decomposition and transformation had completely transformed the laws of laws within a radius of several tens of thousands of light-years into a perfect world of laws. Following the transformation, the scenery within a range of tens of thousands of light-years directly changed into the appearance of a broken world. It seemed as if another world had been opened up within this world. Compared to changing the laws of law in the Tao Master Great World, it was much easier to change the laws of law in this world. In the Tao Master Great World, if Luo Fan had transformed the laws around him into such a state, he would have had to resist the backlash of the laws of the outside world at all times. He would have had to consume an endless amount of energy to maintain the laws of the outside world at all times. But the situation here was completely different. In this world, it was extremely easy for Luo Fan to maintain the laws of the outside world. Not only did he not suffer from the backlash of the laws of the outside world, but he also did the opposite. On the contrary, the laws of the outside world were constantly gathering and actively pouring into this area. They were actively assimilated by the laws within this area, causing the seemingly broken world to continuously expand and the area it covered to constantly increase. When it was first created, this world could only cover a radius of tens of thousands of light-years. However, as time passed, this world expanded crazily. In just a few dozen breaths, it had already doubled in size. In just a few days, it had already covered an area that was calculated to be tens of thousands of light-years. From a distance, it looked like a behemoth was devouring this part of the world. This scene naturally attracted the attention of many cultivators exploring this world. For a time, a wave of perception was cast over from all directions, constantly observing the changes here. During this period, Jianlan was the fastest to react. She immediately sensed an aura that was unique to Luo Fan from the constantly expanding broken world. After understanding the source of this aura, she did not hesitate to use her own power to break through the barrier of this world. In the blink of an eye, she had already disappeared from this part of the world. The facts proved that she was right to be decisive. In fact, the various changes that followed in this world proved that she had made the right choice. Afterwards, it was unknown how many cultivators secretly regretted that they did not leave this part of the world as soon as possible. When the number of cultivators increased, there were naturally all kinds of personalities. Even in this part of the world, there were also cultivators who were not afraid of anything and had a great sense of mission. After sensing the changes in this part of the world, they did not choose to leave this part of the world. On the contrary, they took the initiative to rush towards the center of this part of the world, which was where Luo Fan was at this moment. The laws of heaven and earth treated all cultivators equally. In other words, the laws of heaven and earth were the same. Luo Fan was not the only one who could control the laws of this part of the world at will. These cultivators could also do it. Therefore, very soon, in a very short period of time, hundreds of cultivators had gathered around the broken world. These cultivators obviously knew each other. After gathering here, they had unknowingly gathered together, preparing to work together to fight against the changes that had appeared in the center of this part of the world at this moment. Among these cultivators, the strongest had surpassed the Supreme Emperor and was faintly close to the strength of a second tribulation powerhouse. The weakest had also reached the false sage stage. Although he was also considered a first tribulation powerhouse on the Tao sovereign path, the difference between him and the first tribulation powerhouse that was faintly close to the second tribulation powerhouse was like the difference between heaven and earth. And this naturally caused the status of these cultivators to be different. Those with high status could even order those with low status like ants. However, regardless of whether they were high or low, they all had a strong sense of mission between them. They felt that they had to get rid of the tumor that was affecting this part of the world. Fellow Taoist, what should we do now? A powerhouse who was not too strong but definitely not too weak asked at this moment. The person he was asking was naturally the strongest cultivator in the group. This cultivator looked like a child, but the aura on his body was vast and boundless, filling the world. That kind of awe-inspiring aura made people unable to help but be intimidated by it. Although he had the appearance of a child, the dignified light in his eyes was enough to make anyone forget about his figure and feel reverence for him. At the very least, the hundreds of cultivators gathered here all felt a strong sense of reverence toward him. They didn't even have to fight for the position himself, they all gave him the authority to command. The boy glanced at the cultivator and said, "Is there a need to say anything? Fight your way in. This world has existed here for countless years. Since that force was destroyed, no one has dared to occupy this world. Now, this person dares to commit such a heinous crime. How can we just sit back and watch? If we fight our way in, wouldn't it be a bit?" The middle-aged cultivator felt a chill in his heart when he saw the boy's indifferent gaze. However, he still gave his opinion. After all, not only did this matter concern the ownership of the entire world, but it also concerned their lives. How could he be so easily convinced? Don't tell me you have any other way? With the speed at which the world was expanding, there was no other method. By the time we've circled around a few times, this world would have already grown several times over. The boy said indifferently. Hearing this, the other cultivators all had solemn expressions on their faces. If it wasn't for the fact that the world was growing too fast, why would cultivators like them come here? Could it be that it was fun to fight against a powerhouse of unknown strength? Therefore, they could understand the choice of charging in directly. In fact, this was what they had originally thought. The reason why they placed their hopes on the boy was because the boy's cultivation level was just too high. They couldn't help but hope that he would have a better way, a stronger method to achieve this goal. However, now that even the boy had said so, they could only give up. Seeing that no one objected, the boy began to give orders in a grand manner. He got the cultivators to coordinate with each other according to their cultivation path and set up hundreds of action teams. He also stipulated the order and speed of each team's attack. Then, he led his team and stepped into the world of laws that Luo Fan had constructed by changing the laws. The instant they stepped into the dilapidated world of laws, every cultivator had a look of shock on their faces. Because they suddenly felt that the world in front of them was qualitatively different from the outside world. Although the laws of the outside world were profound and mysterious, they didn't reject all of them from comprehending them. They could obtain all the principles and mysteries they wanted with just a thought. However, the world they had entered was completely different. Although the laws here were many times simpler and cruder compared to the outside world, and they even felt broken, but they were rejected from comprehending them. This feeling was extremely unfamiliar to them. It was also indescribably familiar in a trance. Everyone already understood. This was not any other feeling. This was the feeling they had of the laws of the world before they entered the Tao sovereign path. The reason why they felt so unfamiliar was because they had been on the Tao Master's path for too long. It was so long that the things before they entered the Tao Master's path seemed like a dream to them, and this was the real thing. How is this possible? He can actually completely isolate the laws of the Tao sovereign path in such a world. A cultivator exclaimed at this moment. Many cultivators' expressions changed when they heard the exclamations. All of them became extremely serious. Obviously, they already knew that their estimation of the existence that created this world was wrong. This existence was countless times stronger than they had estimated. They had probably made a huge mistake by entering this world so carelessly. As mentioned before, these cultivators were able to advance without retreating because they had a strong sense of duty. At this moment, when they sensed Luo Fan's strength, not a single one of them retreated. Instead, they all revealed a look of understanding and understanding. Instead, they began to rush towards the center of this world at an even faster speed. However, because the laws of this world had rejected their senses and control, they could not use the changes in the laws of the world to quickly cross spacetime like they could in the outside world. However, he could only turn into streaks of light and fly towards the center. Although this speed was extremely fast, even countless times faster than the speed of light, it was still many times slower than using the laws of the world. At the very least, it would take at least a few days to cross this region that was tens of millions of light years away at this speed. There are actually existences coming over? At this moment, Luo Fan, who was in the center of this world, sensed the existence of these cultivators, and a look of surprise appeared on his face. Just as he was about to send them away, his heart suddenly lit up. Perhaps I can use the power of these cultivators to perfect my world, and then perfect my worldview. With this thought, he stopped what he was doing and raised his hand to point at the void. In an instant, the entire world began to undergo a subtle change. Countless laws of the world and power condensed in front of him out of thin air, turning into various strange creatures that appeared in the void. Some of these creatures were dragons and snakes, some were tigers and leopards, and some were birds and beasts. There were all kinds of them, and their appearances were almost beyond the limits of the imagination of living beings. However, no matter what kind of creatures they were, they had an indescribable adaptability to the laws of this broken world. It condensed into the shadow of a giant in the void, and brazenly clenched its fist and punched at the huge bird claw. The huge bird claw suddenly collapsed under this attack, and the powerful force shattered the void. The broken laws and laws in the surroundings seemed to have been torn apart in an instant, almost turning into powder and flying in all directions. Behind the powder was an absolute nothingness, not the starry sky outside. At this moment, a giant bird with a tiger's head appeared out of thin air. One of the giant bird's claws had already collapsed, and blood gushed out of the wound like a fountain. It covered the sky and covered the earth as it poured down. The scene was so tragic that it was shocking. Obviously, this was the giant bird that had attacked everyone earlier. After the giant bird appeared, it let out a loud tiger roar. Then, the laws in the void quickly flashed, and countless mysterious forces surged from all directions. In the blink of an eye, they had already entered the giant bird's body. The giant bird's claw completely recovered in a flash. Then, the giant bird's body shook, and a strong gale surged. The entire world seemed to be covered by this gale in an instant. The expressions of the cultivators changed drastically at this moment, because they suddenly felt that regardless of whether they joined forces or not, the danger they encountered was exactly the same. The giant bird's attack seemed to have combined the laws of this world, making it impossible for them to resist it with conventional methods. "I'll stay. All of you leave." At this moment, one of the cultivators shouted. When the cultivators heard this, they all came to a sudden realization. However, they already knew that this was the best way to deal with this situation. At this moment, there was no melodramatic thing like, "I'll do it, you do it." Soon, the other cultivators all said goodbye to that cultivator and directly went around the giant bird. These cultivators were all powerful cultivators that could step onto the Tao sovereign path. Such existences, even if they had different personalities, could see the situation clearly. They naturally understood that leaving one person here to resist the giant bird was the right choice. Since leaving one cultivator behind was the best choice, then who else was left behind? Since there were cultivators who were willing to stay, it couldn't be better. Why would they waste time thinking about who to stay? At this moment, the boy's expression was extremely ugly. He glanced at the giant bird, then made a prompt decision to go around the giant bird and continue forward. At this moment, the giant bird didn't pay attention to the cultivators that went around it. Instead, it locked onto the cultivator that spoke just now. It wasn't that it was intelligent enough to understand what the cultivators were saying, but it could clearly feel that at this moment, the cultivator in front of it was emitting all sorts of provocative auras that constantly stimulated its instincts, making it unable to be distracted. After all the other cultivators left, the cultivator that stayed behind let out a sigh of relief. At this moment, the giant bird instinctively felt that an opportunity had arrived and roared. His body flashed, and under the protection of the broken laws, he appeared behind the man and bit at the cultivator. Although the cultivator wasn't the strongest among the cultivators, he was still in despair. At this moment, facing the giant bird's bite, he only smiled coldly. His body trembled. Countless pieces of steel swarmed out from his body and formed into countless mysterious and strange patterns. Then, an earth-shattering power burst out and poured directly into the giant bird's mouth. Normally, a great thousand-world wouldn't be able to withstand this kind of attack. But at this moment, the giant bird suddenly bit down. Countless laws and laws flashed in its mouth, and the giant bird instantly bit down on the steel. Loud cracking sounds rang out, causing the surrounding space-time to shatter and crumble. However, this bite, to the giant bird, it wasn't completely unscathed. With this bite, the giant bird's mouth split open and a copious amount of blood gushed out. It was like a waterfall as it rushed toward the cultivator. In an instant, the cultivator's figure flashed and countless strange patterns appeared around his body. The shattered steel quickly gathered together. The shattered steel quickly gathered and blocked the blood. Then, it began to emit dazzling light that formed countless ribbons that quickly surged towards the giant bird's mouth. At this moment, all sorts of indescribable forces rushed over from all directions. In the blink of an eye, the giant bird's injuries were healed, and the laws that were broken in the surroundings began to quickly recover. He didn't know if it was an illusion, but the man felt that the laws that had just recovered weren't as broken as before, and their structure seemed to have become a little more profound. However, this clearly wasn't the time for him to be distracted. At this moment, the giant bird once again pounced over to attack him. Each of the giant bird's attacks contained numerous laws and endless power. Although this attack didn't have an absolute advantage against the cultivator and wasn't enough to completely kill the cultivator, it was enough to injure the cultivator. During this process, the cultivator continuously injured the giant bird and even beheaded it a few times. However, with the power that came from an unknown source and grew stronger and stronger, the giant bird was able to recover in the blink of an eye no matter how many injuries it suffered. The entire process was like an ordinary person punching water. The water would not be damaged at all. Instead, it would create ripples and cause the peaceful sleep to become violent. As the cultivator was fighting the gigantic bird, the fluctuations of battle began spreading out from the direction where the other cultivators were heading. Moreover, the number of fluctuations continued to increase. Damn it! This is clearly a strategy to take us down one by one. The cultivator gradually understood what was going on and couldn't help but feel intense hatred in his heart. Under this hatred, his movements became even more decisive, and his attacks became even more powerful. As a result, the damage he caused to the giant bird became even more powerful. The impact of the battle on the surrounding spacetime and laws became even greater. The spacetime within a radius of several million kilometers continued to shatter and recover under this battle. Every time it shattered and recovered, the laws seemed to faintly improve, as if they had absorbed some sort of nourishment or experience from the process of shattering and recovering. In fact, there were already over 100 battles like this in this world. Just as the cultivator expected, the cultivators that had gone around the giant bird were being separated by more and more opponents. At this moment, there were over 100 battlefields, and there were at least one or several cultivators blocking the attacks of their opponents. In front of them, there were still a large number of cultivators advancing. However, powerful creatures would appear from time to time, forcing them to stop and fight against those creatures. As a result, the advancing group became smaller and smaller, and the number of people on the battlefield increased. In fact, it wasn't just the battlefields in front of them. Even more battlefields were gradually appearing behind them. At first, this situation made the cultivator very excited. He thought that there were other cultivators who had a sense of duty and knew that something was wrong here. He rushed in from the outside, but he soon realized that he had guessed wrong. He could also sense familiar auras from the battlefields behind him. Those were clearly the auras of the cultivators that had gone around the giant bird. This situation made him suddenly realize that the cultivators in front had most likely been unknowingly transferred to the back, and the newly appeared cultivators there. Or perhaps the cultivators that were originally at the front had only been transferred to the back to continue fighting. This situation made the cultivator groan inwardly. If such a situation could occur, didn't it mean that there was no difference in essence between them moving forward and retreating in this world? While everyone was constantly fighting the many creatures on the battlefields, Luo Fan, who was watching everything happening in the center of this world, had a smile of enlightenment on his face. In his senses, the essence of the laws and rules of this world was in a fierce conflict with hundreds of other completely different essences. There were winners and losers in these conflicts, and not every time the essence of the laws and rules of this world won. But in every conflict, this essence would grow inexplicably, causing him to faintly comprehend traces of mysteries that he couldn't comprehend before. This feedback would then feed back to his worldview, causing it to continuously grow during this process. Luo Fan gradually forgot about the passage of time, and all he could think about was the battle with the many cultivators. In Luo Fan's eyes, this was just an experiment to study his worldview, but to the many cultivators, they were like flying insects that had fallen into a spider's web. The web became tighter and tighter, and it became more and more difficult for them to move. Even their own lives seemed to be constantly being sucked away by a mysterious power. This feeling caused them to curse the cultivator in the center and curse him to die a horrible death. After a few days, the hundreds of cultivators who had entered this world had all split up and began to fight fiercely against the living beings in this world, including the boy. Most of these battles were evenly matched. In other words, the battle between the creatures and the cultivators was in a stalemate. The creatures couldn't get rid of the cultivators, and the cultivators couldn't get rid of the creatures. However, that was only the vast majority. Among them, there was a small portion of cultivators who were truly powerful and were able to win continuously. After one fierce battle after another, they destroyed one living creature after another, allowing their path forward to become smoother. Among them, the boy belonged to that small portion of cultivators. However, after he won a few times, he found that he had been sent to the edge of this world after a few transitions in time and space. The distance between him and the center didn't decrease, but increased instead. Of course, even his position had changed, and he was no longer on the same path as the other cultivators. If it was other cultivators, they would have already realized how big the gap between them and Luo Fan was, and the thought of rushing to the center of this world to stop Luo Fan would definitely not appear in their minds. However, as mentioned earlier, these living beings all had a strong sense of duty. To them, Luo Fan's method was fundamentally wrong and must be corrected. Even if they had to pay with their lives, they must stop Luo Fan. Therefore, they didn't retreat. Instead, they continued to advance without hesitation and continued to fight against the creatures, step by step, towards the center of this world. Even Luo Fan couldn't help but admire their perseverance. However, although he admired them, he didn't show any mercy. Instead, while he was comprehending the various changes in this world, he constantly adjusted the opponents that the cultivators encountered, and even strengthened the opponents that they encountered, causing the speed at which they advanced to become slower and slower. The time spent in each battle grew longer and longer, and the methods that the cultivators used in the battles grew more and more. During this process, time gradually passed. In the blink of an eye, 1,000 years had passed. Over the past 1,000 years, although it had withstood the entanglement of those cultivators, under the resonance of the laws of the outside world, the broken world of laws that Luo Fan had constructed continued to expand. Moreover, the speed of its expansion had reached an astonishing level. This continued for 1,000 years, and this world had unknowingly reached the end of the world outside. It directly enveloped the incomparably vast starry sky, completely changing the nature of this world. There was no longer any trace of the original starry sky. This change was not concealed at all, and the news had already spread after 1,000 years. Most of the cultivators in the outside world were on guard and avoided this world. However, just like there were hundreds of cultivators in this world with a strong sense of duty, there were even more cultivators in the outside world with a sense of duty. After hearing about the changes here, they rushed into this world without hesitation. They wanted to find the source of the changes and solve the changes in this world. And this was just to send more experimental subjects for Luo Fan. In the end, the number of battlefields in this broken world increased to tens of thousands, and his worldview grew even more. Chapter 2003. It's a pity that I've finally reached my limit. On this day, Luo Fan, who was in the center of the world, sighed slightly. His eyes revealed a mixture of sadness and joy. After 1,000 years of evolution, this dilapidated world of laws had grown to a certain limit. Although the process of fighting with other cultivators with the essence of this world was still exciting, it was no longer enough to shake the essence of this world. Or rather, although it was shocking, it was already so shocking that Luo Fan couldn't clearly sense it. The reason for this was very simple. It was because the external force that supported the evolution of the world had disappeared. After all, this world was only a world condensed from broken laws. It didn't have the ability to repair and perfect itself like a complete world. Therefore, the root of the reason why it could continue to endure for the past 1,000 years was that there was still a level outside this world. It was the level of the great world, but there were laws that could be easily comprehended like a perfect world. It was precisely because these rules and laws were constantly replenishing this broken world that this world could be continuously destroyed and reborn. It was also because of this that he could sense the quaking of the essence of the battle without being devoured by the damage. But obviously there was no such convenience now, after enduring for a few more days. He realized that the situation didn't improve at all. On the contrary, it was constantly worsening. Luo Fan could only helplessly admit that things really couldn't be changed anymore. At that moment, he could only sigh. With a thought, he instantly stopped supporting this broken world. Once he stopped supporting it, the broken world instantly shuddered with a bang and started trembling non-stop. The trembling became more and more obvious and intense. In the end, it directly caused every inch of the void in this entire world to tremble violently. Every broken law and law began to tremble violently. At this moment, all the cultivators in this world began to be vigilant. For them, the experience of the past 1,000 years was an intense torment. Now that this world had undergone such a change, their first feeling was that this world was going to have a new change that targeted them. With this thought in mind, how could they not be vigilant? Just as they were on high alert, the living beings that they were fighting began to stagnate one after another. Then, they completely collapsed one after another. In the blink of an eye, all the living beings had crumbled into countless laws and laws. Boundless energy scattered into the surrounding space-time. At the same time, the huge vortex in front of Luo Fan suddenly stopped rotating. As for the creatures that were constantly being born from it, they completely stopped. In the blink of an eye, the vortex began to reverse, and it itself became fainter and fainter. When the Tao reached a certain level, the vortex had already become completely illusory. The entire whirlpool disappeared without a trace, as if it had never appeared. "What's going on?" a cultivator murmured. At that moment, every single one of the cultivators was in an incomparably wretched state. Too many living beings had been born in this world in the past 1,000 years, and there was a huge gap between the strong and the weak. Almost all the cultivators at any level could find existences that were on par with them among these living beings. Precisely because of this, as they constantly probed, or in other words, as Luo Fan constantly adjusted, the opponents they encountered were all creatures on par with them. Under such circumstances, the battles between these cultivators were naturally as fierce as possible. How difficult could it be? Victory? Not being torn apart by the opponents was already a sign of great strength. The boy who first stepped into this world was startled. He scanned the place with his perception and carefully sensed. Then, a strange expression appeared on his face. All the cultivators are still alive. Not a single living being died in these 1,000 years of fierce battles. How is this possible? He murmured with a conflicted expression, and his heart was filled with doubts. Obviously, he had no idea what the existence that created all of this was thinking. Doing such a huge thing, but not killing a single cultivator, it was as if the existence was playing with them. No one died. At this moment, more and more cultivators discovered this unbelievable fact, and their expressions became as strange as the first cultivators. Amidst these strange emotions, they naturally stopped their actions of charging towards the center of the world to kill the being that created all of this. At this moment, this region of the world gradually collapsed and the scenery started to recover. In the blink of an eye, this region of the world had completely changed back to its original appearance. It had turned into a boundless starry sky, and the complete and broken cities that had disappeared were revealed once again. From the looks of it, there was no difference from 1,000 years ago. It was as if the earth-shattering changes from 1,000 years ago had never occurred. Facing this situation, a cultivator suddenly exclaimed, "My cultivation has increased. Ah, I also broke through the bottleneck. Really, I actually broke through. How is this possible? It's only 1,000 years." Following these exclamations, almost all of the cultivators began to sense their own state, their own cultivation realm, and their own power. In the end, they all discovered that their strength had more or less increased compared to 1,000 years ago. There were some who had large increases, such as the hundreds of cultivators who participated in the battle at the beginning. They had all increased in strength that would have taken tens of millions of years, or even hundreds of millions of years. As the cultivators discovered this, their expressions became awkward. From the results, it seemed that their anger and hatred toward that cultivator was completely unnecessary, and it could even be said to be a huge mistake. The other party's actions did not cause them any losses at all. On the contrary, it gave them a huge opportunity, allowing them to inexplicably increase in strength. "If something like this happens again, I will come again." One of the cultivators sighed, turned around, and left the place. However, his emotions were completely different from when he first charged into this world. When he had charged into this world, he had been filled with a sense of self-sacrifice and resentment towards the existence that had created this broken world. But now all he felt was gratitude. He was just looking forward to it. Some of the other cultivators made the same expression, while some just remained expressionless and had slight changes in their eyes. But no matter what expression they made, their thoughts were very different, and they were all making the same decision. One by one, the cultivators left this world with gratitude, but they didn't know that all of this was actually not Luo Fan's plan. He didn't give those cultivators such a great opportunity. In fact, all this while, Luo Fan had only been thinking about his own cultivation and his own experiment. He didn't consider whether they would suffer losses or gain. The fundamental reason why they could gain gains and not suffer losses was that during the battle with the many living beings, they could feel the various essences of the broken world of laws contained in every move of those living beings. In Luo Fan's opinion, these essences were extremely imperfect, and he needed to work hard to make up for them and grow their existence. However, it was already a supreme principle and profundity to all of these living beings. Sensing even a trace of it was sufficient for them to comprehend all sorts of questions that they'd faced in their cultivation in the past and break through all sorts of barriers that they'd encountered in their cultivation. It was only natural for them to grow a little after 1,000 years. And this didn't even need Luo Fan to plan at all. It was a harvest that they had to obtain. Of course, this was because this came from Luo Fan's worldview of laws. After they accepted these essences, whether it would be good or bad for their own path of cultivation, and whether it would interfere with their future cultivation, would depend on their own path of cultivation. If those cultivators' path of cultivation coincided with Luo Fan's worldview of laws, then they would naturally be able to get a huge boost. But if the path of cultivation did not match the worldview of laws, or even the opposite, it would form an inexplicable interference that would affect the improvement of their cultivation in the future. Obviously, Luo Fan didn't have any intention of paying attention to these cultivators. At this time, he had already understood all kinds of things about this world through his own understanding. He easily tore apart the barriers of the rules of that world, directly broke through that world, and came to the outside world. After breaking through this world, his figure came to a boundless void of the universe. Or rather, it was not the void of the universe, but a void where there was nothing but stars. Time, space, matter, and energy did not exist. At a glance, there were countless stars hanging in the void, faintly shining with all kinds of indescribable light. Even the light emitted by these stars was not real, but just a kind of feeling of living beings. In an instant, Luo Fan understood in his heart that this was the main body of the first level of the road to Tao Master. and those stars were the countless worlds that existed in the first level of the road to Tao Master. Do I have to go through the 129,600 square spaces? What a wonderful place for cultivation. Seeing this scene, this thought flashed in his mind. His figure shook, and he chose a world and stepped into it. After crossing that world, he felt as if he had passed through countless layers of strange barriers. In the blink of an eye, he had already come to a world full of yellow sand. The world he chose was not random, but rather, it was a world without much vitality and a rather harsh environment. There would not be many living beings born in such a world, at least not many living beings other than cultivators, but he could change it at will and try to affect as few living beings as possible. As for cultivators, if they could not escape, then they were unlucky. Since they dared to break into the road to Tao Master, they naturally had to be aware that they were not strong enough to pay the price. The Dharma of such a world was also at the level of the big world, and it was also extremely active, allowing him to feel it at will. In this respect, there was no difference from the world he had experienced before. However, if one looked at the various manifestations of the Dharma, it was essentially different from the world he had experienced before, and it could even be said to be completely different. In the face of such a situation, a smile appeared on Luofan's face. Such a world was suitable for his cultivation. His heart moved slightly. He did not bother to talk nonsense, and after sensing for a while, he locked his target in the center of this world. As he lifted his foot and took a light step, his figure had already integrated into the Dharma of this world. In the blink of an eye, he crossed a distance of hundreds of millions of light years and directly came to the center of this world. There were ruins of a sand city here. This sand city was obviously an extremely prosperous city a very long time ago, and the building structure was not much worse than the city in the world he had experienced before. It was also a city built by a great force. However, compared to the forces in the other world that had completely destroyed and smashed the buildings in that world because of the war, the city in this world seemed to have been voluntarily abandoned by that force. Now that these cities had turned into ruins, it was only because of the invasion of the Dharma of this world over the years. Could it be that there is some danger in this world that forced that force to abandon this world? Such a thought suddenly flashed in Luofan's mind. However, after thinking about it, he still smiled and shook his head. No matter what danger there was, he did not think that he would not even have a chance to escape. In fact, in the bottom of his heart, he faintly thought that if some danger appeared to stimulate his worldview, it might be able to make his worldview grow further. Although he had to give up the various means he had used in the other world 1,000 years ago, he had also obtained many benefits from it. Even at this time, looking at his origin of life, the light spot that appeared on the origin that was the manifestation of his worldview was even brighter than before. As for the background of the light spot, it was also slightly brighter than 1,000 years ago. Such a change could be seen with the naked eye. It was enough to prove how great the gains he had obtained were, according to the increase in strength. The current him definitely had the strength to easily suppress the him from 1,000 years ago. Compared to the previous confrontations with him, the progress was much faster. Although this world was full of yellow sand, there were also many kinds of resources. Therefore, at this time, there were hundreds of thousands of cultivators exploring and fighting everywhere in this world. Although this world was filled with yellow sand, there were also various types of resources. As a result, there were hundreds of thousands of cultivators exploring and fighting each other in this world. In fact, there was even a cultivator looking for something in the ruins before them. With a slight thought, he directly sat on a throne in a large hall in the center of this world. This throne was extremely magnificent. Sitting on it, it was as if the entire world was under his control, and he felt an indescribable sense of satisfaction. This throne was extremely grand. Sitting on it, it was as if the entire world was under his control, and there was an indescribable sense of satisfaction. This throne was extremely magnificent. Sitting on it, it was as if the entire world was under his control, and he felt an indescribable sense of satisfaction. It seems that this is the throne of the master of this force. In an instant, he understood what was going on with this throne. At this moment, his heart stirred slightly, and he continued to input the parameters of his worldview into the decomposition and transformation law. Gradually, the laws of the world around him changed rapidly, causing the scene of a broken world to appear around him and rapidly expand in all directions. In just a flash, it had completely enveloped the ruins of the city that spanned several light years. It even caused the entire world to tremble slightly, causing the laws of this world to take the initiative to pour into this broken world, causing this world to expand at an even faster speed. During this process, Luo Fan was still constantly inputting the parameters of his worldview into the decomposition and transformation law. Although the speed of this inputting was beyond imagination due to his increase in experience, it was still impossible to complete the inputting in an instant. However, after all, he had enough experience. Although the inputting time couldn't reach instantaneous, it only took him a day to complete the inputting. As all the parameters were completely inputted, this broken world finally reached a barely complete level. The resonance it produced with the outside world that was covered in yellow sand also strengthened to a certain peak, causing all the living beings in this world to notice that this world was about to undergo a drastic change. Similar to the previous world, the cultivators in this world also began to separate. Some were cautious, timid, and afraid of trouble, and directly chose to leave this world, staying away from the upheaval that was about to occur in this world. As for the cultivators who were adventurous or had a sense of mission, they went against the flow and began to rush towards the center of this world, wanting to clarify things with Luo Fan. As for the cultivator who had been in the ruins of the central city before, he had already been sent away by Luo Fan. Now, he was rushing out like a stray dog, trying to hide from the constantly expanding broken world of laws behind him. Chapter 2004. Luo Fan naturally wasn't in the mood to pay attention to the various emotions of the cultivators. At this time, he was merely replicating his previous actions in the other world. He was constantly sensing the various mysterious mysteries that manifested in the process of the continuous expansion of this broken world of laws. He was also sensing the impact that his worldview of laws had to endure in the process. When the first living being that broke into this world appeared, it began to condense the vortex that gave birth to living beings. The vortex began to produce living beings that were transported to various parts of this world and began to build a defensive network of living beings. While blocking the cultivators, it also used the battle between the cultivators and the living beings to shake the essence of this broken world of laws, allowing the essence to be stimulated more and more in the process and grow more and more. Faced with such a situation, the living beings that broke into this broken world began to feel stronger and stronger pressure. They began to be like the first wave of living beings that broke into the previous world. They were filled with resentment and even resentment towards Luo Fan who caused all of this. Of course, this wasn't enough to stop the cultivators with a sense of mission and responsibility from breaking into this world. They worked hard to break the defensive network of living beings and approached Luo Fan. There were more living beings in this world than in the previous world, but the number of living beings that broke into this broken world was much fewer than in the previous world. In the end, only 100 or so living beings broke into this broken world to crush Luo Fan. Apart from these 100 or so cultivators, all the other cultivators had fled this world. In just a few days, this world had become empty. Except for the inside of the broken world, as those living beings fled, the news of the changes in this world gradually spread, and more living beings came to know about it. Just a few days later, the cultivators that had just fought against Luo Fan's broken world of laws in the other world heard the news. For those cultivators, this was simply a shocking surprise. After hearing this news, those living beings didn't care what they were doing. They immediately gave up and quickly rushed towards this world. They quickly rushed into this broken world and began the cultivation process that they had been going through for thousands of years. In this way, in just a few months, hundreds of thousands of cultivators had gathered in Luo Fan's broken world of laws and were constantly fighting against the living beings he had condensed. And the increase in the number of cultivators naturally caused the shaking of the broken world's essence to become even more intense. Therefore, as a result, the impact on this broken world became greater and greater. This influence was naturally transmitted to the outside of this broken world. In other words, in this world where the level of the laws of this world was equivalent to that of this world, it caused the laws of this world to become increasingly stronger. Naturally, it caused the speed at which the laws of this world surged into this broken world to continuously increase. This also caused the speed at which this broken world was expanding continuously. Back then, this broken world had spent 1,000 years to completely occupy that part of the world, completely changing the appearance of that part of the world. But at this moment, it had only taken 100 years for this broken world to completely replace the original world. My cultivation speed is 10 times faster than before. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan felt both helpless and happy. Since it had expanded to the limit, it naturally meant that he had reached the limit of his cultivation in this world. There was no longer any meaning for him to continue staying in this world. After understanding this, he no longer hesitated, and his heart trembled slightly. The living beings in that broken world could no longer be reborn. The Jihu that was destroyed completely disappeared. And this broken world also began to collapse. By the time the millions of cultivators reacted, this world had completely returned to how it was before Luo Fan had arrived. At this moment, Luo Fan had already torn apart the barriers of laws in this world. He broke through this world and returned to the void between the many worlds. The cultivators who stayed behind gradually came to their senses and confirmed that the rumors they heard were true. Indeed, coming here to cultivate was not only not life-threatening, but one could also obtain many benefits, allowing one's cultivation realm and strength to improve by leaps and bounds. For a time, many cultivators began to secretly thank the existence that created this broken world and began to look forward to the start of another round of cultivation. There's no change at all. Luo Fan, who had arrived in the void, did not care about the cultivators. He had this thought in his mind. The change that he was referring to was naturally not the 100 years of hard work that did not bring about any changes to his strength. In reality, the 100 years of training had already allowed his strength to make great progress, allowing his cultivation realm to rise a little. Even the fourth tribulation had been brought forward by quite a bit. Such a change, no matter how one looked at it, was a huge improvement that was worth boasting about. When he said that there was no change, he meant that the entire cultivation process was essentially the same as the previous one. It was still so smooth originally. He was already prepared to encounter some changes in the world filled with yellow sand and expect some unexpected opponents to appear. However, he did not expect that there would be no abnormalities when he finally completed his cultivation. It was as if it was just an ordinary world, and the possibility of this happening in the ruins of that world was quite small. After thinking about it, he just frowned and threw this idea to the back of his mind. He began to look for another world that could provide him with cultivation. As his eyes swept around, he quickly found the place he was looking for. With a slight thought, he directly stepped into that world. At this time, the world he chose was a boundless sea of fire. Here, all the mountains and rivers, all the insects, fish, birds, and beasts, and everything else were all condensed from flames. Apart from this point, this world could even be said to be full of vitality. However, it was unknown whether it was because of the restrictions of the Dharma or the shackles of this Tao Master Universe itself, but this world of flames did not give birth to intelligent life. intelligent life that could exist in this world of flames. But they were either strong or weak cultivators. Such a world was obviously in line with the principle that Luo Fan had set for choosing a world. The Dharma of this world was not much different from the original world. It was also at the level of the great universe and could also be easily understood. He could easily understand the Dharma of the Dharma. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan didn't waste any more time and directly arrived at the center of this world. There was a fire tree that was almost indomitable here. There were countless fruits growing on the fire tree. The fruits contained all kinds of indescribable mysteries and seemed to have many benefits for cultivators. Therefore, there was a considerable number of cultivators on the fire tree at this time. Even a considerable number of living beings in this world of flames gathered around the fire tree. On the tree there were also various kinds of people who were busy. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan raised his hand and made a grabbing motion. A fruit appeared in his hand. Although the fruit was condensed from flames, its internal structure was extremely complicated and mysterious. Countless different flames intertwined, condensed, and combined in various mysterious ways. They transformed and finally turned into this fruit. The fruit contained the Dharma of the essence of the world, and they stayed in the fruit in a strange way. Once the fruit was consumed, it was equivalent to being baptized by the Dharma of the essence of the world. It could even retain many Dharma of the Dharma in one's body, allowing one to obtain shocking benefits. After sensing the fruit, Luo Fan raised his hand and pinched it. The fruit collapsed abruptly and turned into countless flames. Countless fragmented nomological laws scattered in all directions, as if a firework had bloomed in his hand. After that, Luo Fan's heart moved. He lifted his foot and took a step forward. His figure had already arrived at the top of the fruit tree. This was also the place where the heat of the fruit tree was the most concentrated and the most violent. Normally, ordinary cultivators would need to protect themselves to barely get close to this place. However, to Luo Fan, the flames were like warm breezes. They only made him feel inexplicably comfortable when they blew on him, but they were not enough to cause him any harm. There were quite a number of cultivators on this tree. Since they could come here, they were naturally not weaklings. They were naturally quite clear about Luo Fan's appearance here. However, due to Luo Fan's instinctive defense, they couldn't clearly see his face. At this time, when he came to the hottest and most violent place, his defense became even more intense. They couldn't even be sure whether Luo Fan had left or not. At this moment, Luo Fan began to input the parameters of the world of laws into the decomposition and transformation law. A broken world began to unfold and quickly changed the fruit tree. The cultivators on the fruit tree were sent away in an instant. At this moment, this broken world began to expand and strengthen continuously. Gradually, it spread outwards. Such a scene made many cultivators in this world horrified. A well-informed cultivator even exclaimed, "Great, it's this world's turn this time." At this moment, he was extremely happy and immediately rushed towards the broken world, directly crashing into the broken world that was now only a few dozen light years away. Over 1,000,000 cultivators had obtained benefits from Luo Fan, and the well-informed cultivators had already learned about the nature of Luo Fan's broken world. At this time, there was no need for cultivators with a sense of mission and responsibility to break into this broken world and prepare to fight against Luo Fan. Instead, any cultivator who wanted to improve dared to break into this broken world. This process forced Luo Fan to condense those living creatures immediately and begin to distribute their defenses. Fortunately, the laws of this broken world were the laws of the world of laws, and it was difficult for cultivators from the outside world to understand. Therefore, even if it was only a few dozen light years away, it was already huge enough. It was enough to form a great obstacle for them, giving him enough time to set up defenses. Due to the influx of cultivators at an unimaginable speed, this broken world also expanded at an unimaginable speed. In just a few days, it had completed the expansion that would have taken several months to complete. At this moment, the number of cultivators that had poured into this broken world had unknowingly increased to the number that could only be achieved in the second world after 100 years. In other words, there were millions of cultivators in just a short period of over 50 years. This world could no longer accommodate Luo Fan's cultivation. In other words, the broken world of laws had completely occupied this entire fiery world. Luo Fan, who had long been experienced with this, did not hesitate. He immediately dispersed this broken world and directly broke through the barriers of laws, leaving this world and heading to the next world. With his departure, the world returned to its original state. It looked exactly the same as before he had arrived. It was as if nothing had happened. Whether it was the living creatures or the huge fruit tree, there were no losses. This situation made the living creatures that were still here feel as if they were in a dream. In this way, Luo Fan continued to choose worlds to enter and unfold the broken world of laws. The many cultivators who had benefited from it followed closely behind him. Once they heard that he was in a world, they began to gather in that world from all directions. They continued their previous cultivation process. In this way, a new cultivation method was gradually formed, causing the number of cultivators following Luo Fan to increase. After the 100 worlds, the number of cultivators had already reached several hundred million. It had already reached several hundred million. At this point, it had already formed a force that could not be underestimated. If Luo Fan was willing, he could probably form a force that could overthrow any rogue cultivator force with just a shout. It was precisely because of this that many rogue cultivator forces did not dare to make a move against Luo Fan. The loyalty of these cultivators who had gathered because of the benefits of cultivation was extremely terrifying. The loyalty of any rogue cultivator force was definitely far inferior to theirs. After all, the cultivators who could enter the path of a Tao sovereign must have an urgent desire to improve their cultivation. For them, the existence that could improve their strength, whether it was a newcomer or an old person, a disciple of a Tao sovereign or a penniless beggar, could obtain their greatest loyalty. Fortunately, this allowed Luo Fan's subsequent actions to become more and more smooth. It could even be said that many worlds opened their doors wide, wishing that they could directly tell Luo Fan, come to our world, because every time Luo Fan opened the broken world, the number of cultivators that poured in was simply too great. As a result, every time Luo Fan opened the broken world, the speed at which the world expanded had reached an unimaginable level. After arriving at the 100 worlds, almost any world was not enough for him to stay for more than a year. Every time he opened the broken world for less than a year, the broken world would receive the greatest blessing from the world due to the impact of the essence of the many cultivators, causing its size to grow to the limit that the world could accommodate, to the point where it completely overlapped with the size of the world itself. Although this made the many cultivators somewhat dissatisfied, it also greatly saved Luo Fan's time, which made him feel more and more satisfied. In this way, time gradually passed. The 129,600 worlds that Luo Fan originally thought would take tens of millions or even hundreds of millions of years to complete were approaching the limit at an unimaginable speed. After nearly 100,000 years had passed, Luo Fan finally arrived at the last world that he needed to pass through in the first level of the Tao Sovereign's path. When Luo Fan came out of the 129,599 worlds and floated in the boundless nothingness, an indescribable enlightenment emerged from the bottom of his heart. I'm finally at the last step. In an instant, he understood what was going on, and such a thought flashed through his mind. The moment this thought appeared in his mind, he suddenly felt that among the countless worlds in the nothingness, there were a few that had an inexplicable attraction to him. This inexplicable attraction made those worlds stand out among the countless worlds, so he noticed their existence at first glance. It seems that my last world can no longer be randomly chosen, but I have to choose one of these worlds. Such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind as he felt the attraction from the worlds. Teacher, please wait. Just as Luo Fan was about to choose a world to enter, a voice entered his ears. This is that cultivator. The moment he heard the voice, Luo Fan instantly knew who the cultivator was. Chapter 2005. In 100,000 years, he had moved 129,599 square kilometers. In other words, there were 129,599 chances for other cultivators to discover Luo Fan's identity. And behind Luo Fan, there were hundreds of millions of cultivators following him closely. Under such circumstances, it was only normal for his identity to be discovered. With so many experiences, as long as there was a slight oversight, it would be enough for those cultivators with heaven-defying analytical and reasoning abilities to catch on to it. As the first cultivator to come into contact with Luo Fan's broken world of laws, the boy was naturally the first cultivator to discover his identity. Luo Fan had already expected this to happen, so he wasn't too surprised at this time. "I don't deserve to be called a teacher," he said at the moment. Teacher's guidance over the past 100,000 years is equivalent to giving us a new lease on life. "How can I not be called a teacher?" the boy said solemnly. Hearing this, Luo Fan just said indifferently, "I'm just cultivating on my own. It's your own fate that you can obtain the benefit." The boy said, "Although teacher is just cultivating on his own, it's undeniable that teacher has brought us enough benefits over the years. No matter from which angle you look at it, teacher is our teacher." At this moment, cultivators appeared not far away from the boy. After they appeared, they all bowed to Luo Fan like the boy did, looking quite respectful. The number of these cultivators naturally couldn't be all of them. There were hundreds of millions of cultivators following behind Luo Fan, and there were only a few thousand of them. After all, not all cultivators thought the same as them, thinking that Luo Fan was their teacher since he had given them so many benefits. Most cultivators thought the same as Luo Fan. They just thought that they were cooperating with each other to achieve a win-win situation. Under such circumstances, although they were loyal to Luo Fan, they didn't think that they should respect him as their teacher. Luo Fan swept his gaze over these cultivators and no longer bothered about this matter. He said, "Why are you stopping me?" Hearing this, a look of joy appeared on the boy's face. It was clear that Luo Fan had acquiesced to their address. He immediately said, "Master, I have calculated the world that you have experienced over the years. The next world should be the last world that you have experienced on the first level of the Tao Master's road. Once he breaks through this world, he'll leave the first level of the Tao Master's path." "So what?" Luo Fan frowned. He was not surprised that these cultivators could calculate the number of heavens and earths he had experienced. 129,600 might seem like a long time to ordinary living beings. However, for cultivators it was not a big number. As long as one paid attention, they could easily calculate it. Perhaps teacher already knows, but as his disciples, we have no choice but to report what we know to teacher. The final world's choice was fundamentally different from the previous worlds. This was a very important matter. It would determine the tribulation that Master would encounter in the end. Once you make a wrong choice, the intensity of the tribulation will skyrocket by 1,000,000 times. "Please be careful, teacher," the boy said with great sincerity. "Tribulation?" Luo Fan frowned. He had never heard of any tribulation appearing after breaking through this last world. Hearing this, the boy did not seem surprised at all. He thought that Luo Fan might not know this kind of news. Otherwise, he would not have appeared here at this time to stop Luo Fan and tell him this. Hearing Luo Fan's doubts, it only confirmed his previous suspicions, so there was no need to be surprised. Exactly. This is between the first and second level of the Tao Master's path. There is a layer of tribulation in the way. Any cultivator who wants to break through the shackles of the first level and step into the second level will encounter a tribulation. This kind of tribulation can appear in any form, and its power can also be any kind. Since ancient times, some cultivators have even passed the tribulation after being slightly baptized by lightning, while others have encountered the crushing of countless worlds and suffered the invasion of chaos. In the end, even the traces of their existence are completely erased. It is said that what kind of tribulation one will encounter is determined by the world one passes through in the first level of the Tao Master's path. The key to all of this seems to be the final world. The boy didn't hesitate to reveal everything he knew at this moment. Hearing this, Luo Fan suddenly became more and more curious about this final world, and he could not help but smile excitedly. I see. Then I really need to choose a world carefully, he murmured. Hearing his words, the boy and the many cultivators behind him suddenly felt uneasy. Vaguely, they seemed to feel that they had done something bad by coming here with good intentions. Looking at this teacher's appearance, the direction of his interests seemed to be different from what they had imagined. According to what they had thought, after hearing their explanation, Luo Fan should choose the world with the weakest tribulation. But looking at Luo Fan, it seemed that he was more interested in the stronger tribulation. "Teacher, please reconsider," the boy hurriedly shouted at this time. Luo Fan just smiled and said, "Thank you for your reminder, but don't follow me to experience the world this time. This time, I'm afraid my cultivation will be different from before, and it will be quite dangerous for you." As he spoke, he looked up at the worlds that had an inexplicable attraction to him, and carefully sensed the worlds that gave him the strongest sense of danger. That's right, just as the cultivators thought, Luo Fan at this time did not choose the world with the weakest tribulation, but the world with the strongest tribulation. Of course, this was not because his adventurous mind suddenly erupted, but because he had already seen through the nature of the tribulation, and understood that the stronger the tribulation, the greater the benefits it would bring him. After all, he now had an incomparably firm Tao of himself, so he did not need to find his own cultivation path from the tribulations at all. Under such circumstances, all the worlds were essentially the same to him. Under such circumstances, the more powerful the tribulation was, the more difficult it would be for him, and the more stimulating it would be for his worldview. In this way, was there a need to say what he should choose? As for how to choose the world with the strongest tribulation, there was no need to say anything. For him, whose telepathic ability was now so strong, all the changes in the future could be traced. It was naturally a little difficult to choose the world with the weakest tribulation, but to choose the world with the strongest tribulation, he only needed to sense the most dangerous world. In the blink of an eye, his figure had already passed through the barrier of the world, and directly arrived at the world he had chosen. This part of the world looked very ordinary. It was a strange world like the Tao Master Grand World. The various laws here were very similar to the Tao Master Universe, and they were also very balanced. There was no inclination towards any kind of power, and it looked like an ordinary world. With a sweep of his senses, he could even sense that there were countless living beings, countless civilizations, and even an incomparably magnificent cultivation world in this world. Among them, there were quite a number of cultivators that belonged to the Tao Master Path, but there were even more cultivators that were born in this world. The cultivators that came from the Tao Master Path were at least at the false saint stage, and their bodies revealed an inexplicable sense of transcendence. They could easily leave this world. However, the cultivators that were born and raised in this world were completely different. Although there were cultivators above the false saint stage among them, such cultivators did not feel transcendence at all. It seemed like they were completely restricted in this world. Not to mention leaving this world, they could not even sense the outside world of this world. The reason for this was very simple. In the eyes of the cultivators that came from the Tao Master Path, Although the laws in this world were at the same level as the laws of the greater world, they were completely open to them. They could easily comprehend it. However, for the cultivators that were born and raised in this world, the laws of this world were the same as the laws of the greater heaven and earth. Although it did not exclude them, it set up countless obstacles for them to comprehend it. They had to take countless detours and go through all kinds of mysterious methods to be able to comprehend it. Under such circumstances, even if the cultivation realm of this world was higher than the cultivation realm of the cultivators that came from the Tao Master Path, it was impossible for them to have the transcendent aura that they had. This world was the first time that Luo Fan had entered a world that was similar to the Tao Master Path. It was also the first time he had seen the similarities between the living beings in this world and the cultivators on the Tao Master Path. At this moment, countless thoughts flashed through his mind. It was as if countless comprehensions had been born, but it also felt like there was nothing. His mind was blank in a trance. He seemed to have a deeper understanding of the Tao Master's path, but he could not describe it in detail. He was all too familiar with this situation. He did not know how many times he had felt this after cultivating for billions of years. Therefore, he instantly understood that this was clearly something that he had sensed instinctively. However, because it was just an instinctive feeling, it did not go deep enough to cause this situation. When he could truly comprehend the root of it, he would naturally be able to clearly express this understanding. What a mysterious Tao Master Path! At this time, he could only sigh with emotion. Just as he had said before, he did not plan on following the original method of cultivation this time. At this moment, with a single thought, he had already stepped into a certain cultivation city in this part of the world. This cultivation city was the node of the cultivation civilization in this world. It gathered almost all kinds of cultivation civilizations in this world. Almost all the cultivation ways in this world could be found in this cultivation city. He did not have a specific goal. In this city, he was only collecting cultivation methods and information that he could find to deepen his understanding of this world. After cultivating in the previous 129,599 square worlds, Luo Fan's cultivation realm had already made great progress, and his perception of the fourth tribulation had been advanced to less than 3 million years. This time, compared to the original time that was calculated in hundreds of millions of years, had naturally been shortened to the point that it was as if it was right in front of him. Under such circumstances, even according to the standards of this world, his strength was already at the peak level. He was like this. Although he could not do whatever he wanted in this world, he did not have to worry about what he wanted to do. There were very few things that he could not do. Therefore, in just a few short years, he had already walked through many cultivation nodes in this world. He had already traveled to many nodes of the cultivation civilization in this part of the world. He had clearly seen all the paths of cultivation contained in these nodes. Through these paths of cultivation, he had gained an extremely deep understanding of the various mysteries of this world. Combined with his own understanding of the laws of this world, he even faintly felt that his understanding of this world had completely surpassed his understanding of the Tao Master Great World. This is a world that leaves people in despair. In the end, when he discovered that his understanding of this world's cultivation civilization had already reached a point where he could no longer comprehend it in depth, he arrived at the highest mountain peak in this world, overlooking the world from the side. He thought about it. As the highest mountain in this world, this place had a very special meaning in this world. Here, the most powerful force in this world was stationed. And it was a sect established by a cultivator whose strength was not much weaker than Luo Fan's. At this time, not far from Luo Fan stood the cultivator. This was an old man with white hair and a youthful face, with a sage-like demeanor. The old man looked at the position where Luo Fan was, but in his eyes there was no reflection of his figure, as if the existence of Luo Fan could not be detected at all. How many times has this been? How much is 137,830? It seems to be more than 7,000. The old man suddenly sighed. You can really sense my existence. Luo Fan looked back at this time with a faint smile. He looked at the old man. He was a cultivator who came from the path of Tao Master. In this world, he was born to understand and control all the rules and laws of this world. In other words, it was an existence that was absolutely protected by the rules and laws of this world. Under such circumstances, if he did not want to be detected by the cultivators born in this world, he did not even need to use any cultivation method or use any power. As long as he thought about it, the rules and laws of this world would naturally protect him, so that he would not be detected by even the strongest cultivators in this world. Under such circumstances, there was actually a cultivator who could break through the protection of the rules and laws and discover his existence. This was enough to prove that the cultivator was not simple. It's already been more than 100 million times. No matter how stupid I am. No matter how stupid I am, I can still understand some trick. The old man sighed at this time. At this time, Luo Fan's heart moved, and the protection of the rules and laws of this world disappeared. His figure appeared in front of the old man. It was also at this moment that his figure was reflected in the eyes of the old man. At this moment, the bitter smile on the old man's face became more intense. Although he could guess that there was a cultivator in this location based on his many experiences, he still felt a strong sense of defeat after seeing it for himself. After all, this was the mountain gate that he had set up, and he was the most powerful cultivator among the cultivators born in this world. However, in such a state, in such a mountain gate, it was like a public toilet. People could come and go as they pleased. It was easy to imagine how frustrated he was. Thank you, fellow Taoist. At this moment, he could only smile bitterly and bow. Of course, Luo Fan knew why the old man was thanking him. It was obviously because Luo Fan showed his figure at this time instead of hiding. However, this kind of gratitude also made him feel sorrowful. He had invaded the other party's territory, but the other party had no choice but to show him some respect. How sorrowful and helpless was this! At this moment, he only smiled and said, If fellow Taoist doesn't want to experience this helplessness, can't you just move the mountain gate to another location? This location was the top of the highest mountain in this world. Whether it was in terms of territory or symbolism, no other location in this world could compare to it. If the cultivators who entered this world had a sudden impulse and wanted to choose a mountain to rest on, the most likely place would naturally be this mountain. Therefore, the old man set up his mountain gate here. It was equivalent to a bright spot in the darkness, and it was normal for it to attract many cultivators. To solve this problem, the best way was, of course, to take drastic measures and empty this place. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan made such a proposal. What's the difference? You're just deceiving yourself. The old man only sighed. His eyes revealed a kind of determination and an indescribable determination. Seeing this, Luo Fan could only express his admiration. The old man's choice revealed the firmness of his Tao heart. He did this not because he had a strange hobby, but because he wanted to use this kind of humiliation to stimulate his spirit and increase his cultivation motivation so that he could improve faster and more steadily. Chapter 2006. However, although he admired the old man, Luo Fan did not intend to help the old man transcend this world. It was not only because the old man was a native cultivator of this world, but also because he felt that this kind of suffering might be a good thing for the old man. Heaven never bars one's way. No matter how lowly a creature was, or even a rock that was not a creature, there was a chance to achieve Tao, or even become a sage. This kind of cultivator, who was born and raised in this world, naturally had a chance. The reason why he could not leave this world at all, and could only endure the humiliation of being flaunted in front of him by an existence whose cultivation was far inferior to his, was because he was not strong enough. His cultivation realm was not high enough. Under such circumstances, this kind of humiliation and suffering, for him, was just a different kind of cultivation path. As for the discomfort and pain, it was nothing compared to the final achievement of Tao. Immediately, he directly sat down cross-legged, suspended in the air, and began to discuss Tao with the old man. In addition to the fact that the old man was born and raised in this world and was shackled by this world, his cultivation realm was similar to that of Luo Fan. In the path of Tao Master, he might not be an expert of 3 or 4 tribulations, but he was definitely more than an expert of one tribulation. The cultivation of such an existence naturally had its merits. Perhaps Luo Fan might not be able to obtain a qualitative improvement by interacting with him, but the benefits he could obtain would definitely not be little. Compared to Luo Fan, because the old man was shackled by the rule of heaven and earth, there were not many strange phenomena when he talked, and the surroundings were still calm. There was not much special at all. Even if the content of the old man's talk, under normal circumstances, would be enough to cause a shocking phenomenon in any perfect world. It would make the whole world seem as if it was changed, but for Luo Fan, the situation was completely different. Although in terms of cultivation realm, the difference between Luo Fan and the cultivator in front of him was not so great that it had completely changed their nature. However, because Luo Fan could freely manipulate the laws of the great Tao in this part of the world, just the slightest bit of profoundness in his speech would naturally cause all sorts of strange phenomena to appear in this world. An exotic fragrance assailed the nostrils, golden lotuses appeared on the ground, and rays of light appeared in the sky. The sound of celestial music, lightning flashed, and thunder rumbled. The tallest mountain in this world seemed to be shrouded in countless strange phenomena, and every word that Luo Fan said seemed to have a huge echo in this world, causing the whole world to begin to tremble slightly. Such a large number of strange phenomena obviously did not just strengthen his power. In fact, such a strange phenomenon formed a huge blessing to the content of Luo Fan. This blessing was almost like a demonstration of the content that he was talking about, causing every word that he said to go deep into the core. Not only did the old man who listened to the content of his talk seem to be constantly enlightened, but even the preaching Luo Fan also unknowingly comprehended some things that he had not comprehended before from the content of his talk. Such a change! He unknowingly became immersed in it. Even the conversation he had with the old man had been thrown to the back of his mind. All that was left in his mouth and thoughts were his own path of cultivation and the feedback he had received from the things he had said. Under such circumstances, the communication naturally couldn't continue. Fortunately, the old man no longer had any interest in continuing the conversation. As the content of Luo Fan's talk increased, the various strange phenomena that were triggered became more and more complicated and mysterious. He was gradually immersed in the content of Luo Fan's talk, and unknowingly, he had completely forgotten that there were times when he should also speak. The content of Luo Fan's talk increased. The Tao that he talked about became more and more profound. In the end, he unknowingly touched on many aspects of the laws of the world. Of course, this was only the specific content. He naturally could not easily talk about the fundamental concept of the laws of the world and the importance of the cultivation of the world. However, this was more than enough for him to explain his own cultivation path. As for the understanding of others, it was obviously not something that he cared about. This also proved that he was currently completely immersed in his own world and had completely forgotten about everything in the outside world. As Luo Fan began to talk alone as if he was talking to himself, his voice and the phenomenon gradually spread in all directions, eventually allowing more and more living beings to hear what he was talking about. In the end, living beings and cultivators began to gather towards the tallest mountain in the world from all directions. Those who could not fly could only listen at the foot of the mountain, while those who could fly gathered in the air and tried their best to get as close as possible to the place where Luo Fan was talking about the Tao. As for the old man's mountain gate, it was completely filled with cultivators at this time. The densely packed figures seemed to have turned into a sky curtain that covered a larger and larger area. However, whether it was Luo Fan or the old man, they were no longer in the mood to care about all of this. In fact, it was not only them, but the cultivators and living beings who came here had completely forgotten all their previous thoughts after they were immersed in the Tao, regardless of whether they had other thoughts at the beginning or not. All they could do was completely remember the content of Luo Fan's talk in their hearts and try their best to understand the principles contained in it. Apart from that, everything else was completely secondary to them. Among them, there were more living beings and cultivators who belonged to this world, but there were also quite a lot of cultivators who came from the Tao Master's path. However, compared to the living beings and cultivators who were born and raised in this world, who accepted it completely and felt that it was a great opportunity for them, the cultivators who came from the Tao Master's path in search of opportunities and resources were secretly vigilant and eventually immersed in it. On the contrary, there were fewer of them. In fact, even those who were immersed in it were only slightly immersed in it. He was always ready to escape at the slightest sign of trouble. The content of Luo Fan's talk contained more and more mysteries of the worldview of laws, as well as the influence it had on the surrounding laws. As it gradually transformed and changed, the various phenomena caused by his preaching also began to gradually change. The changes converged bit by bit, and in the end, those phenomena were like some inexplicable skeleton that was building a strange world. This change was extremely subtle and mysterious. If one were to look at it as a whole, it would be an earth-shattering change. But if one were to look at it separately, every single change would seem so natural, and there was nothing special about it at all. None of the living beings and cultivators who were listening to Luo Fan's lecture could react to how big the overall change was. Even the old man sitting not far from Luo Fan was the same. Even the cultivators who entered this world from the Tao Master's path did not feel much. Time passed bit by bit. 3 years passed in the blink of an eye. During these 3 years, the phenomena caused by Luo Fan's preaching had already covered nearly 1/10 of this world. Moreover, the number of living beings and cultivators gathered here had reached nearly half of this world. That was not the main thing. More importantly, the appearance of these phenomena had completely changed at this time. It had completely turned into an incomparably broken world. The strange phenomena that were constantly appearing seemed to be the foundation of this broken world. The appearance of each strange phenomenon was supplementing and enriching this broken world, allowing this broken world to evolve towards a perfect state as much as possible in this broken world. The laws became more and more complete as they changed. The difference between this world and the outside world also became greater and greater. And inside this broken world, an aura that only Luo Fan's world of laws could emit appeared from nothing. From thin to dense, it had long since become incomparably dense. It was as if a liquid had filled this broken world. In this situation, it was obvious that this broken world was the world of laws. However, this broken world of laws was completely different from the world of laws that Luo Fan had constructed in the previous 125,999 worlds. Back then, that world of laws was completely formed by Luo Fan inputting the parameters of that world of laws into the decomposition and transformation law, causing the decomposition and transformation law to transform the laws and laws of the outside world. Although it was also constructed by him, it was still with the help of external forces. Fundamentally speaking, it was still impossible for him to construct that broken world with his own strength. However, this broken world was different. This world was formed completely by his preaching, which naturally changed the laws and laws of the outside world. It could be said that every bit of this world was constructed by his own understanding. In other words, although this world was more broken than the previous many broken worlds, every trace of laws, every bit of time, space, matter, and energy that had formed here was something that he could completely understand and control. Compared to the original world, this was equivalent to one being machine-made, while the other was handmade. Obviously, it had a stronger spirituality, and the connection with him was also closer. It also made him feel more comfortable and joyful than before. The living beings that were enveloped by this broken world also gradually changed during this process. It was as if they had been assimilated by this broken world. From weak to strong, more and more living beings were assimilated into this world. They began to transform according to the instinctive requirements of this world. They entered the cycle of this world, and began to play a role that was completely different from their original selves. Because of the addition of these creatures, the evolution of this world became even faster, and the mysteries that were revealed during the evolution also became richer. Of course, after these living beings joined the cycle of this broken world, they seemed to be in a completely different time and space from the living beings that were originally listening to the preaching. Even if their positions overlapped with those living beings, there would be no interference, and they each went their own way. Those who were listening to the preaching continued to listen, and those who were playing roles continued to play roles. It was precisely because of this that so many cultivators and living beings were listening to the preaching here. Only then could the other living beings have space to play their roles, and they would not wake up because there was no space for them. As Luo Fan continued preaching, more and more living beings joined in to play roles. Time continued to pass, and more living beings joined in to play roles. After 100 years, this world had expanded to nearly 90% of the outside world. At this time, 99% of the living beings in this broken world that were participating in the role-playing had reached the level of 99% of the living beings listening to the preaching. In other words, 99% of the cultivators listening to the preaching here had completely left their original positions. Instead, they threw themselves into the cycle of this broken world, playing the role they played in this broken world. This caused the broken world of laws to feel incomparably prosperous. There were various civilizations, forces, and even the cultivation civilization seemed to be flourishing for these living beings who were playing their roles. Their original lives and memories had all been reborn. They had been replaced by new memories, and the world in their eyes was different from the living beings in the outside world. Even the broken world in the eyes of the living beings that were still listening to the preaching was completely different. In their eyes, the world they were in was an incomparably complete world. Although all the laws in the world were faintly broken, they did not feel that this was a sign of a broken world. Instead, they felt that this was the original appearance of the world. They were comprehending the laws of this broken world, experiencing time, space, and everything else. They were tirelessly urged by some mysterious mystery in their hearts to do everything in line with their identities. Among them, there were living beings and cultivators that were born and bred in this world. There were also quite a number of cultivators who had stepped into this world from the path of Tao sovereigns. No matter what identity they had, as long as they were included in the cycle of this broken world, naturally they would completely forget everything about themselves. They would turn into another person and go through another life. And their participation also made this world have more vitality, causing the broken world's acceptance of Luo Fan's preaching to constantly increase. In the beginning, Luo Fan needed to spend so much time and gather so many principles to barely form this broken world. But now, he only needed 1 or 2 words, or even just a little inspiration from the bottom of his heart, to make this broken world receive it and naturally change. This sensitivity was hundreds of millions of times stronger than before. In fact, it was precisely because of the addition of these creatures that his sensitivity had grown so much. This allowed Luo Fan to build this broken world of laws in just a short 100 years by relying on the phenomena produced by his sermon. After such a long time, in the remaining 10% of this world, there were no longer any cultivators who had stepped into this world from the Tao Master Path. There was no other reason. Those living beings had already seen the tragic consequences of stepping into the broken world. How could they still dare to stay in this world and wait for themselves to fall into that tragic situation? As for those cultivators with a sense of mission and responsibility, all they could do was to announce the changes here and let other cultivators deal with it. However, they did not dare to step into the broken world at all. The cultivators with a sense of mission at the beginning were already the best proof of this kind of courting death. Not to mention anything else, the boar that was working with the sow was a cultivator with a strong sense of mission who had originally reached the false sage stage. However, this did not mean that there were no living beings in the remaining 10% of the area. On the contrary, the remaining 10% of the area was even more lively than the most prosperous area in this world. The number of living creatures had almost filled up the entire area. These were none other than the living beings and cultivators that had been born and bred here. Those cultivators who had stepped into this world from the path of Tao sovereigns could naturally leave this world at will. However, the native living beings of this world did not have such convenience at all. No matter how strong they were shackled by this world. No matter how strong they were, they could not leave this world. Under such circumstances, they continuously avoided the broken world formed by Luo Fan's Tao preaching. In the end, they naturally came to the remaining 10% of the area. With so many living beings piled up in this 10% of the world, fighting for the remaining resources that were less than 1% of the entire world, there was naturally no need to mention the tragedy and darkness. It could be said that this area had already turned into a chaotic area that had never happened in this world since ancient times. Chapter 2007. This slaughter became more and more intense as the broken world created by Luo Fan's preaching continued to expand. That baleful aura became denser and denser, gradually turning into a hazy fog that enveloped the remaining area, causing it to slowly turn into hell. This scene was so horrifying that more and more living beings took the initiative to enter the broken world created by Luo Fuan's preaching in order to avoid this slaughter, going to play another part in their lives. It's really tragic. At some point in time, this voice suddenly echoed in the remaining 10% of the area. When that voice entered the ears of the countless living beings, they felt an indescribable coldness and calmness envelop them. Their original terror, hatred, bloodlust, and fanaticism all calmed down in an instant. It was as if their minds had returned to the calmest and most indifferent state they had ever been in. Who's there? A cultivator who was even more powerful than a supreme emperor shouted at this moment. This voice echoed in the world, and even many living beings in the broken world sensed it. Suddenly, their bodies began to struggle strangely. You don't need to care who I am. Now I'll give you all a chance. The calm and cold voice echoed once again, entering the ears of almost all living beings. Compared to the roar of the cultivator who had surpassed the supreme emperor stage, this voice was fundamentally different. It was as if they were at two extremes. What kind of opportunity? The cultivator who had surpassed the supreme emperor level forcefully suppressed his hatred and asked. For this cultivator who could already control himself, no matter how angry or humiliated he would still be able to consider things rationally. For things that were beneficial to him, he would still be able to consider them rationally. Thus, even though he was extremely suspicious of the person who had spoken and was extremely wary, he did not kill him with one strike. He was not even willing to listen to him. I'll give you all a chance to break that world, the voice said. Break that world. The eyes of many living beings lit up. Although they were able to maintain their safety now, it was only temporary. As the world continued to expand, their residences would become smaller and smaller. In the end, they would definitely be enveloped by the world. In fact, the reason why they were so unscrupulous and fought for survival was because of this hopeless future. Not to mention, no matter how good this place was, but it was also not their original home, and it was not a place they were familiar with. It was clearly not comfortable for them to live and cultivate in such a place. As such, living beings like them naturally planned to return to their original residences at all times. "That's right, I can help you break through that part of the world, as long as you pay a small price," said the calm and cold voice. Hearing this, the vigilance in the hearts of all the living beings suddenly rose. The price could be a big or small word. The price to pay was so great that even one's own life essence would have to be put into it for all eternity. There was a small price to pay, perhaps just a few kowtows. How could they not be vigilant when they were asked to pay such a price for a phrase that covered such a wide range? Of course, it was only those who were strong and rational. Only the remaining 10% of cultivators who were still alive and well could truly maintain their rationality. The living beings who were about to die and had no chance to enter the broken world to avoid death did not have the time to consider so much. To them, as long as they could break through that part of the world, they would be safe and enjoy peace again. Then any price would be acceptable. Therefore, the living beings all shouted, "Immortal, please grant us our wish. We're willing to pay any price." These words directly messed up the original plans of the cultivators who were still on guard. "Damn it! Will we die if we say it later?" Some cultivators yelled hatefully. However, at this moment, the calm and cold voice clearly did not care about them anymore. To the owner of this voice, their status was not much different from that of the other living beings. Since there were enough living beings who agreed, it was naturally enough. As for the situation of the remaining cultivators, it did not matter. At this moment the voice said, "Then pray with all your heart. Open up your hearts and release your power. I will guide you." Following this, the countless living beings began to kneel one after another. A louder and louder prayer gradually echoed, becoming louder and more pious. An indescribable power began to be released from the bodies of the living beings. It gradually stirred up the surrounding laws and laws, stirred up the surrounding time and space, and stirred up the huge amount of murderous aura that was born from killing and resentment. Along with this change, the remaining 10% of the region began to surge like a storm. It was as if a large hand was reaching in and stirring up the region. It was as if it was carrying out some unimaginable plan with the power within it. Although many cultivators remained clear-headed and were unwilling to pray, open up their hearts, and release their power, they were still insignificant compared to the countless living beings. However, even though they were extremely powerful, they were still insignificant compared to the countless living beings. Even with all of their powers combined, they were still unable to resist the devout prayers of the living beings. Unknowingly, their hearts had been blinded, causing more and more cultivators to kneel on the ground and join in the prayers. As more and more cultivators joined in the prayers became more and more intense. A huge vortex began to gradually appear above the remaining 10% of the area. This huge vortex was blood-red in color, but it didn't look bloody or murderous. On the contrary, it looked like a sparkling and translucent ruby, looking so pure and beautiful. As it rotated in the void, strands of blood-red light flowed out of the whirlpool and were received by the prayers of all living beings. They were transmitted into the hearts of all living beings, connecting all living beings together. In turn, they guided power from all living beings back into the whirlpool, making the whirlpool even more powerful. As it grew larger, the speed at which it rotated also became faster and faster. This scene shocked the cultivators who still had some rationality. The moment they saw the vortex, it was as if countless bolts of lightning were echoing in their hearts. The little bit of resistance in their hearts was completely shattered. All the cultivators instantly lost their minds and knelt on the ground. They released their hearts and released their power. They began to pray piously. Just at this moment, Luo Fan, who was preaching, felt his heart stop. His mind, which had been completely immersed in his preaching, suddenly felt an indescribable sense of danger envelop him. In a trance, his blank eyes regained focus, and he looked at the broken world that had been formed because of his preaching. He also looked at the huge blood-red vortex that existed outside this world. In an instant, all the changes he had caused during his long lecture appeared in his mind. All the phenomena he had caused when he had lectured about the Tao, and how those phenomena had created this broken world. How this broken world had been perfected and expanded. In the end, how the many cultivators listening to his preaching were included in his own cycle, allowing them to play their own roles here, as if they were in a normal, perfect world. All of this was known to him at this moment. I didn't expect there to be such a change. Originally, I just felt that the situation this time would be different from before. I didn't expect it to be so dangerous for the cultivators following me. Such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind at this moment. This change in front of him was not part of his plan. Originally, he had only chosen to step into this world due to some inexplicable premonition. The cultivation method he would choose after stepping into this world was not completely decided beforehand. Instead, it was based on his understanding of this world. He wanted to feel something in this world, and he planned to use this kind of feeling to determine the cultivation method in this world. As for why he had stopped the boy and the others from following him, it was only because he had an inexplicable feeling in his heart that if they followed him, they would probably suffer a lot of damage. However, it was not that he had known this would happen. At this moment, seeing this happen, he was only slightly glad that he had not let them follow him. All kinds of thoughts flashed through his mind, but he did not stop preaching. Instead, he continued to preach the various mysteries of his worldview. Through the extremely sensitive reactions of laws, he transformed them into the source of power in this broken world, constantly enriching and replenishing the broken world. As the world continued to expand, it became more and more complete. After he woke up, he did not stop pulling in the many cultivators. In fact, he did not even slow down. On the contrary, he suddenly accelerated. Many cultivators who were originally able to resist almost could not resist at all at this moment. They were pulled into the operation of the world and participated in the cycle of the world. In just a few dozen breaths, the living beings listening to Luo Fan's preaching in front of him had completely disappeared. All the living beings, including the old man who had been preaching with him, had been taken into the broken world. They played the roles that the broken world needed and participated in the operation of the world. At this moment, Luo Fan locked his attention on the blood-red vortex that was floating high up in the sky outside this broken world. The vortex was constantly rotating at this moment, and an indescribable mysterious power was constantly communicating with the many living beings who were praying devoutly below. In Luo Fan's eyes, it began to continuously improve, and its essence was constantly strengthening. It contains the characteristics of the 129,600 worlds. At this moment, a kind of enlightenment appeared in Luo Fan's heart. The vortex in front of him was extremely mysterious, and he could sense a familiar feeling from it. It was none other than the feeling of the 129,600 worlds that he had experienced before. In other words, it was some sort of extremely profound existence within the 129,600 worlds that had condensed together to form this blood-red vortex before them. This is the predestined fate. After understanding the source of the vortex, Luo Fan understood what it represented. It was also at this moment that he understood why he had felt a sense of discomfort when he had passed through the second world. It turned out that this was the accumulation of some kind of predestined fate from the two worlds that had been following him, which was why he had that kind of feeling. At this moment, the blood-red vortex shook, and the many living beings who were praying devoutly below all trembled. Then, they turned into streams of light that shot into the sky and quickly rushed into the inside of the vortex. They merged into the vortex and became a part of it. It's about to start. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart trembled. With a thought, he raised his hand and pointed at the vortex. As the broken world surged, endless power gathered and turned into a ray of light that shot into the sky, charging straight at the huge blood-red vortex. Kacha! 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 The moment the light and the blood-red vortex came into contact, a series of loud explosions erupted from the vortex. It felt like billions of nuclear bombs had been charged into the vortex and detonated. Even the laws of the outside world, which were at the level of a great world, began to shake violently at this moment. This scene. It was like the end of the world. However, the vortex wasn't damaged in the slightest. Instead, it looked even more crystal clear than before. Even its size was a lot bigger than before. What a sturdy essence! At this moment, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. Before this thought flashed through his mind, the huge whirlpool had already begun to move. Figures rushed out one after another, taking on all kinds of indescribable postures in the void. Blotting out the sky and covering the earth, they pounced towards this broken world. These figures were none other than the many living beings that had been sucked in by the blood-red vortex. However, compared to before, every single one of these living beings was countless times stronger than before. It felt like every single one of them was countless times stronger than before. Just the combination of their auras was enough to shake the world, causing the laws of the entire world to be stirred crazily at this moment. It formed waves of surging winds and clouds, turning into a passageway that directly crushed this broken world. Like a drill, it continuously drilled into the depths of this world. At this moment, Luo Fan felt like there was a drill drilling into his head. Although it hadn't drilled through yet and he didn't receive any unbearable damage, he already felt an indescribable pain. He felt that his mind, his power, and his view of the world were all being violently shaken. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan let out a soft cry. In an instant, countless broken laws condensed and turned into countless incarnations of laws. They began to pounce into the drill-like law passage, continuously shattering it. This stopped the passage of laws from continuing to drill forward. However, it had already opened a door to rush into this world. This allowed the living beings, who were now glowing with blood-red light and were at least 2 or 3 levels stronger than before, to bypass the influence of this broken world and rush into this world. They began to engage in a fierce battle with the living beings in this world. It's actually this kind of tribulation. This is simply a great tribulation of the world. Such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. If it was just these cultivators who rushed into this world, he naturally wouldn't have said such words. However, he was very clear that this was only the beginning. One had to know that these living beings were merely living beings of this part of the world. In other words, they only represented the tribulation of this world. After all, besides this world, there were an entire 129,599 worlds that he'd experienced before this. In other words, there were still 129,599 tribulations of similar intensity, or perhaps even more powerful, brewing. How could he not be emotional when he thought about how the countless living beings had increased by 129,600 times? However, although he could predict that the tribulation would definitely become extremely powerful, he clearly couldn't admit defeat. He didn't feel that he couldn't fight back because of this. At this moment, with a thought, he raised his hand and grabbed at the void. The laws in this broken world started to change subtly. Under this change, the living beings that had been drawn in and turned into a part of the world's cycle all felt their power increase endlessly. Their cultivation realm also climbed to an extremely high peak at an unimaginable speed. The rules and laws around them, which originally had great restrictions on them, now treated them like their own children, taking care of them in a way that they couldn't even dream of. It could be said that they could almost get whatever they wanted, and they could advance in whatever way they wanted. As a result, the combat power of the living beings in this world skyrocketed thousands of times compared to before. Chapter 2008. At this moment, other creatures that were different from the previous blood-colored creatures rushed out of the blood-colored vortex. Although the blood-colored creatures that rushed out at the beginning were all different in appearance and had all sorts of characteristics, the blood-colored creatures that rushed out at the beginning were all different. Phoenix update fast, however, as long as any living creature saw it, they would know that it was a living creature from the same world as them. This was because they were the same in an indescribable nature. However, the other blood-colored creatures that rushed out of the blood-colored vortex were different. The indescribable nature of these creatures was completely different from the creatures that rushed out of the vortex earlier. This difference allowed any creature to see that they were not from the same world as the creatures that rushed out of the vortex earlier. Upon seeing this, Luo Fan already knew that his previous guess was correct. Compared to ordinary living beings who could only distinguish that these living beings came from different worlds, he could clearly remember which of the 129,599 worlds these living beings came from. Among the many worlds, the worlds that Luo Fan chose were all those with harsh environments that were not suitable for ordinary creatures to live in or for the birth of civilizations. Of course, the number of creatures in such worlds was countless times less than the number of creatures in this world. However, at the same time, due to the harsh environment, the living beings that were born in those worlds were many times stronger than the living beings in this world. This was clearly just a difference between quantity and quality. I didn't expect them to not be creatures that exist now, but creatures that exist in history. As the number of creatures increased, Luo Fan gradually recognized the nature of those creatures, and his heart trembled. The number of creatures that rushed out of the vortex was clearly far more than the number of creatures that existed in the world that he remembered. This situation was obvious at a glance. The number of creatures that were summoned from the vortex was not limited to the number of creatures in those worlds. Instead, it included all the creatures that existed in that world in history. The moment he realized this, he knew that it was not a wise choice. Perhaps it was not a wise choice for him to choose such a harsh environment to comprehend. Although the number of living beings in those harsh environments was much fewer than in the prosperous world, but, on the other hand, the living beings that could survive in these worlds were of a much higher standard than the living beings in normal prosperous world. Originally, they had an advantage in numbers, but if the living beings that had appeared in those worlds in history were added, the advantage in numbers had clearly been erased. Even in such a harsh environment, the number of living beings born over the countless years of history was definitely inexhaustible. In such a world, he could summon as many creatures as he wanted. Moreover, apart from that, the worlds that had been wiped out due to the Great War, and even the worlds that once had living beings but no longer had any living beings due to the changes in the environment, would no longer be as he had thought. Instead, countless living beings would be summoned over, just like the other worlds. The speed at which the giant vortex summoned creatures was incomparably fast. In such a short period of time, Luo Fan had already felt it. The number of living beings that rushed out of the vortex had already exceeded 100 trillion. These 100 trillion living beings were like a flood that swarmed out from the broken entrance of the broken world. In the blink of an eye, they filled up and down the broken world. Almost every inch of the void in this broken world had turned into a battlefield. Every living being here had to participate in the battle. Fortunately, Luo Fan had used a method to raise the cultivation of the countless living beings in this broken world, allowing these living beings to exert power that far exceeded their original strength. This was the only reason why this broken world wouldn't be instantly occupied by the living beings from the outside world, and then completely destroyed by this world. On the contrary, with the help of the broken world, The living beings in the broken world were constantly slaughtering more and more living beings. They gradually restrained the attacks of the many blood-colored creatures. During this process, the endless mysterious power erupted from the destruction of the blood-colored creatures. The terrifying power was contained in their own destruction. They continued to fuse with the broken world, gradually causing the laws of the broken world to squirm. They began to gradually change, gradually spread, and actually gradually evolved in a complete direction. This was the change of the broken world itself. But from Luo Fan, he felt that his worldview seemed to be undergoing some kind of indescribable forging. This kind of forging made him feel unimaginable pain every time, but after this pain, his world of laws would receive indescribable benefits. It became more condensed, and all aspects of it would fuse more tightly. Even the originally dim places seemed to burst with light because of the forging, as if the light was gradually becoming stronger. Such a situation clearly meant that he was constantly seeking a huge amount of benefits. This change in the worldview naturally gradually fused with the broken world outside through his continuous preaching, causing the broken world to strengthen bit by bit. At the same time, it also allowed the living beings in the broken world to receive the blessing of the broken world. With this increase, the fighting strength of the living beings in the broken world grew stronger, and the attacks on the overwhelming blood-colored creatures became stronger and stronger. Although the broken world was broken, because it was constructed according to Luo Fan's worldview, it had a complete reincarnation system. With this reincarnation system, even if the living beings who played various roles in the broken world were killed in battle, they could quickly reincarnate through this reincarnation system and be reborn in the broken world. They would grow at an unimaginable speed and continue to join the battle. As for the terrifying energy consumed during this period, for Luo Fan, it was a trivial matter that could be solved with a thought. After all, Khanate Golden Immortal Realm cultivators were already capable of creating their own energy. At Luo Fan's level of cultivation, the Khanate Golden Immortal Realm cultivators were capable of creating their own energy. He could even create a world with a single thought. How much energy did he not have? Not to mention the reincarnation of these creatures. Even if there were millions or billions of lives reincarnating, he could still make up for all the consumption in the process with a single thought. It was precisely because of the existence of this reincarnation system that even though the number of living beings in this broken world could not be compared to the number of living beings that were pouring in endlessly from the blood-colored vortex, the entire battle was still in a stalemate. The blood-colored living beings could not gain the upper hand at all. In the face of such a situation, Luo Fan gradually regained his composure. In order to continuously strengthen this broken world, the only thing he could do was to keep preaching. He constantly sorted out the changes that happened to his worldview and turned them into the mysteries of cultivation, the mysteries of heaven and earth, and the truths of the universe. Therefore, even though there was no one listening to him preaching at this moment, he did not stop at all. He opened his mouth and spat out words after words of wisdom, preaching everything that he thought and thought. This scene looked rather mysterious, just like the legendary Buddha who was besieged by tens of thousands of demons. The sound of preaching shook time and space. It was changing the rules and laws. If it was before, without the huge blood-colored vortex, such changes would definitely cause the broken world to expand continuously. This would inevitably cause the broken world to expand continuously, developing towards the trend of completely occupying the entire region of this world. However, at this moment, due to the existence of the blood-colored vortex, these changes could only be converted into strengthening the rules and laws of this world and strengthening the living beings in it to resist the attacks of the numerous blood-colored living beings. Each of the 129,600 worlds had trillions of living beings. Under such circumstances, it was impossible to tell how many trillions of living beings there were. Under such circumstances, the tribulations that besieged Luo Fan's broken world obviously wouldn't end so easily. Time ticked by. Unknowingly, 100 years had passed. During these 100 years, the blood-colored vortex constantly spewed out more and more living beings to join in the siege of the broken world. And at this moment, these blood-colored living beings no longer gathered together and rushed into the broken world through an entrance. Instead, they directly opened 129,600 passages and split into 129,600 groups that rushed into the broken world from all directions, forcing the living beings in this broken world to resist with all their might. However, compared to the past, this broken world had undergone earth-shattering changes. Even after opening 129,600 entrances, it had become countless times stronger than before. The originally extremely rough and dilapidated scene had completely disappeared. What replaced it was an extremely perfect world of laws. And under the blessing of this world of laws that had undergone earth-shattering changes, the living beings inside had risen to a height that they couldn't compare to in the past. Now, almost any living being could be compared to a fake saint, even if they were just ordinary living beings. As for the strongest one, it even made people feel that he had already surpassed the current Luofan. In other words, he had almost reached the level of a three-tribulation powerhouse. However, it was a pity that they were only able to obtain this ability with the help of the broken world, so their cultivation was greatly restricted. Their ability to destroy the broken world was greatly reduced, and they couldn't execute it perfectly. It was precisely because of this that even though these living beings were so powerful, they still couldn't easily deal with the many living beings pouring in from the 129,600 entrances at this time. They could only entangle with those living beings, and in order to protect this world, they had no choice but to sacrifice their lives. After 100 years of development, the huge vortex had already grown to an unimaginable size. It seemed to have filled the entire world, directly enveloping the broken world like a huge shadow. According to Luofan's calculations, from the beginning until now, the number of creatures summoned from each of the 129,600 square worlds had already exceeded trillions of quadrillions. The flesh and blood of such endless living beings had brought him endless benefits, making this world more perfect. It also made him feel that his entire world of laws had been illuminated. However, in the face of such a change, Luofan himself wasn't too happy. This kind of illumination was forced by external forces, and perhaps some of it was completely suitable for him. It was also completely suitable for the world of laws of a true saint. However, that was only a very small part of it. However, most of them were only specious. Those that needed him to clean up and eliminate again, under such circumstances, although he had obtained some benefits, it wasn't that exaggerated, so what was there to be excited about? However, this was obviously something that would happen after this tribulation. At this time, the most important thing was to resist the tribulation imposed by the huge blood-red vortex and completely annihilate the blood-colored living beings. This was the only way. Only then would there be a future. Suddenly, a strange living being rushed out of the blood-red vortex. This strange living being seemed to be made of yellow sand. In the air, it was like a blood-red sand mist. It quickly rushed towards this broken world through the passage that represented the second world that Luofan had passed through. The reason why Luofan noticed this sand-like living being among the billions of living beings was very simple. It was because he sensed an extremely familiar sense of threat from this sand-like living being. With Luofan's memory, it was naturally impossible for him to forget a certain kind of feeling from just a few 100,000 years ago. In an instant, he already knew. This was the feeling that lingered in his heart when he stepped into the second world, which was also the world filled with yellow sand. However, the feeling back then was countless times smaller than what he sensed from this sand-like living being at this moment. What is this? Luofan was shocked. In the past 100 years, he had seen billions of living beings. Among them, there were many that were stronger than this sand-like living being, but he had never sensed this kind of threat from those living beings. This living being was only equivalent to a second tribulation expert, but it had already made him feel this kind of threat. How could he not be careful? At that moment, under his control, many living beings in this broken world let go of their original opponents and came to the passage that the sand-like living being was about to pass through. The moment the sand-like living being rushed in, it directly pounced on it and used its strongest method. The most sinister method was directly blasted towards the living being. Crack! This kind of explosive sound was extremely inconspicuous in the boundless battlefield before them. It was like the most ordinary of battlefields, and only the most ordinary living beings died. The sense of threat that Luo Fan felt before seemed to be just an illusion. Was it really an illusion? This thought appeared in Luo Fan's mind. Before this thought had even passed, he had already sensed an abnormality. A strange life essence had suddenly appeared in the reincarnation system of this broken world that he had constructed. This life essence was fundamentally different from the countless living beings that originally existed in this world. It carried a sense of threat that Luo Fan was familiar with. It invaded the reincarnation system of this world? In an instant, Luo Fan understood what was going on. He could not help but feel unimaginable shock in his eyes. This broken world was constructed by him while he was preaching. Everything in it seemed illusory yet real. It could even be said that it was a complete reflection of the world in his heart. Even existences that were as powerful as him could not invade such a world. And now, right before him, the yellow sand that gave him a sense of threat was actually beginning to invade the reincarnation system of this world. It looked like it was about to reincarnate into this world and obtain the blessing of this broken world. At this moment, Luo Fan hurriedly thought of something. The power of the reincarnation system suddenly condensed, freezing the life essence and stopping the process of reincarnation. At this moment there was a soft crack, and the life essence collapsed with a loud bang. As it collapsed, the power of the reincarnation system naturally could not freeze it anymore, and it lost its effect in the blink of an eye. However, with his previous experience, Luo Fan clearly did not think that the life essence had already disappeared. In that instant, he released his perception to investigate this broken world. He thoroughly investigated all living beings, all matter, and even every location in this part of the world. After all, this was a world that he had constructed. Even if it was constructed by the phenomenon that he produced during the preaching process, it would not change this essence. Therefore, his control over this world had reached an unimaginable level. As long as it existed in this world, he would instantly know it. Therefore, he very quickly locked onto a living being that had just been born in this world. That living being was an ordinary living being. As soon as it was born, it naturally received the support of the broken world, instantly raising its strength to the false saint stage. Chapter 2009. Seeing how vicious the creature was, Luo Fan frowned. With a thought, the area where the creature was suddenly separated from the outside world. It was also at this moment that an extremely powerful creature suddenly kicked the area that had been separated from the outside world. Rumble, 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 as loud explosions rang out, the area that was being devoured was instantly kicked out. It streaked across the sky like a meteor, and in the blink of an eye, it had already left the world that was not too broken. After rushing out of this world, the creature had already devoured the entire region in an instant. It appeared out of thin air and appeared in the region that had yet to be enveloped by Luo Fan's world that had been born from Luo Fan's preaching. After arriving here, the creature seemed to be at a loss. It jumped up and down in the area, as if it wanted to devour the surrounding space-time, laws, matter, and energy. However, it could not move the laws around it, nor could it devour them at all. Seeing this, Luo Fan's heart trembled, and an indescribable feeling surfaced in his heart. He vaguely seemed to have comprehended something, but because this comprehension disappeared too quickly, he could not grasp it at all. With a thought, he secretly gritted his teeth. The broken world suddenly produced a suction force that directly acted on the creature. It directly pulled the creature into the world. This speed was many times faster than when it had turned into a meteor and kicked it out. In a flash, the creature had already appeared in the world born from Luo Fan's sermon. After entering the world, the creature instantly broke away from its bewilderment and began to devour everything around it, including the creatures. Moreover, it did not matter whether it was the creatures that belonged to this world, the creatures that had been sucked in by Luo Fan to play their roles, or the creatures that had rushed in from the blood-colored vortex. They were not picky at all and devoured all of them. This tyrannical appearance, it was fundamentally different from the somewhat dazed state it had in the outside world. At this moment, Luo Fan did not care about how much space-time, laws, and living creatures the creature had devoured. At this moment, he was wholeheartedly experiencing the entire process of the creature devouring and comprehending the various indescribable mysteries revealed in the process. The reason why he let the creature in was naturally not because he was soft-hearted when he saw that it was at a loss outside. If he had discovered that the creature could not absorb any matter from the outside world when it was at a loss in the outside world, the reason why he discovered this was because he wanted to bring the creature in. This was because what the creature could not do in the outside world could be done so easily here. Clearly, this was a great stimulus to Luo Fan, who thought that even if the world he had created could not compare to the outside world, it would not be too different in essence. It made him realize that the world he had created still had a huge loophole. Now, what he had to do was discover the specific situation of this loophole. Then, he would make up for this loophole. In his opinion, the creature in front of him might be the greatest opportunity for him to get through this calamity. Other opportunities. In comparison, it was nothing at all. This creature naturally wouldn't be polite to Luo Fan. It seemed to only have the thought of constantly devouring, and didn't care about anything else around it. It didn't feel any abnormality in the environment that Luo Fan had specially created. It seemed to be slowly devouring everything around it, but its essence was unimaginably fast. This creature devoured other living creatures regardless of which side it was on. Therefore, at this moment, even if its own world was constantly being devoured, the living creatures on its side were constantly being devoured, but the overall situation of the battle was still in a stalemate. After all, Luo Fan's side was being devoured, and the blood-colored vortex's side was also being devoured. In this way, it was equivalent to the battlefield shrinking. How much of an impact would it have on the overall situation? As Luo Fan's mind moved, the environment around the creature constantly changed. All sorts of strange environments constantly changed around it. At the same time, the surrounding laws were also constantly shifting and changing, constantly changing into different laws. These different laws were used to test the efficiency of the creature's devouring of the different laws. Even though the devouring speed was rather shocking, the world that Luo Fan had created was, after all, unimaginably vast. Therefore, waiting for the creature to completely devour this part of the world would obviously take a very long time. This also gave Luo Fan enough time to test the creature's devouring effect. The creature itself was not too strong. At least, in this part of the world, compared to the creature that Luo Fan had blessed and the creature that was spat out by the blood-colored vortex, it was not too strong. Under such circumstances, the devouring of all living creatures meant that they would encounter enemies they couldn't resist at all times. Therefore, death was naturally a matter of course. However, in this part of the world, the reincarnation system was clearly like a back garden to the creature. It could enter and leave as it pleased. To it, death was only a short pause, and it would reappear in the blink of an eye. Because of this, the creature's devouring of everything in the outside world was not only fixed at one location. It needed Luo Fan to constantly shift other laws to test the devouring effect. Instead, it could constantly shift. Moreover, it was constantly shifting. Every time it was reborn through the reincarnation system, it would not appear at its original location. Instead, it would randomly appear at any location in this part of the world. Under such circumstances, every time the creature died, it was equivalent to moving to a location that might be billions of light years away from its original location of death. In this way, it could naturally constantly shift from place to place. For such a creature, Luo Fan constantly locked onto it. He constantly used various methods to test the effects of the creature's devouring. He wanted to see the various mysterious mysteries that the creature revealed in the process of devouring. After all, this part of the world was opened up by him through his teachings. Under such circumstances, he wanted to understand everything that had happened. Naturally, it was extremely easy. Even the creature's strange devouring method was only a little troublesome for him. It was not to the extent that he could not grasp it. He could not understand it, therefore, in just a few short years. Luo Fan had already discovered some clues. He grasped the indescribable feeling he had when he first saw that the creature could not devour anything in the outside world. It can only devour everything that is not at the level of a perfect world. An indescribable and pleasantly surprised thought appeared in his mind. In an instant, Luo Fan raised his hand and made a grabbing motion. In an instant, a huge palm reached across the air and directly grabbed the creature. This time, the creature had already turned into an earthworm. After being grabbed by Luo Fan, it began to writhe violently. Its huge mouth began to bite everywhere. It even reached past Luo Fan's palm, wanting to devour Luo Fan's palm. However, it was obvious that the creature's strength was there. This was a world created by Luo Fan's teachings. In such a place, how high was Luo Fan's authority? It went without saying that he could do anything. Therefore, how could the creature's choice be successful? At this moment, Luo Fan gently shrunk and the creature was instantly brought in front of Luo Fan. With a slight tremble, it left that part of the world and directly appeared in the same world as Luo Fan. Upon arriving at this place, the creature instantly became confused. Amidst this blankness, there was something incredibly subtle, obscure, and complicated. It felt as though an infinite amount of Tao of the true sage was compressed and condensed within it. Waves continuously extended and shrank from its body. There was a series of trembles as though it was detecting something. As though it was searching for something. I see. So this is how it uses this method to find out what it can devour and what it can't. This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. Just like how ordinary people could use their 5 senses to determine what was edible and what was inedible, every living being had their own way to determine what was edible. The creature in front of him was no exception. For these living beings that could devour the laws of time, space, matter, energy, and other existences of the outside world, this method of determining what could and couldn't be eaten was naturally to determine what laws of perfect heaven and earth were, and which weren't. And obviously, for this creature, what was detecting all of this was the mysterious wave that was coming from its body at this moment. Even Luo Fan couldn't comprehend it thoroughly. After finding this wave, Luo Fan did not hesitate to use his perception to penetrate into the body of the creature in front of him. He wanted to carefully investigate the source of this wave and find out the principle behind it. As for the reason, was there even a need to say it? For him, although the world of laws had grown tremendously in the tribulation this time, and even the broken world in front of him was no longer as broken as it was before, there must be an endless amount of water in all of this. In other words, there must be countless combinations that were taken for granted. There must be a huge amount of laws of the world that were not at the perfect world level and everything else. And if these remained in his world of laws, they would definitely affect his future cultivation. He would need to spend a lot of time to discover them and then get rid of them. Only then would he be able to make further progress. In the past, He could only use the law of decomposition and transformation to separate them. But with the wave of this creature, the efficiency would naturally increase by countless times. Not to mention that this wave was so mysterious, it must have even more incredible uses. If he could grasp it, it would definitely be profitable, and it might even be enough to greatly increase his strength. At this moment, he felt his power that had probed into the creature's body being instantly devoured. He didn't reveal anything about the situation inside the creature's body at all. What a powerful devouring method! At this moment, such a thought suddenly flashed through Luo Fan's mind. The situation in front of him was clearly the result of his perception being instantly devoured after it probed into the creature's body. After this thought flashed through his mind, he already understood what was going on. As long as the creature in front of him was not a perfect world-level existence, it could devour it. And a perfect world was able to exist freely in a state of chaos. As long as it didn't encounter the great tribulation of heaven and earth, it could exist forever. If it was a cultivator, it would obviously be a true sage-level existence. As for him, he was still very far away from the true sage level. In this way, he was naturally within the scope of the creature's devouring ability, and his perception probed into the creature's body. It was natural for him to be devoured. Since this doesn't work, I'll change to another method. This thought flashed through his mind. Then, he raised his hand and the nomological laws of the outside world came under his control, directly entering the body of the creature in front of him. Although these nomological laws were at the great heaven and earth level, because of the special state of the Tao Venerable Path, they could be controlled by him. Under such circumstances, these nomological laws were naturally the best tool to investigate the situation of this creature. As for how to use this tool, it was not a problem at all for Luo Fan. Using the nomological laws to sense the essence of something was just an instinctive ability for ordinary false saints, let alone for Luo Fan. This creature was constantly reincarnating, changing countless bodies and images, but it could still easily distinguish whether the outside world was a perfect world or not. Could also easily devour everything in the outside world. That naturally meant that to this creature, the real key was its life essence, not its physical body. Therefore, at this time, Luo Fan only took a rough look at the physical body of this creature and had already turned the target of the nomological laws to the depths of the creature's body, to the life essence that existed in the depths of the creature's body. Luo Fan had seen the life essence countless times, but this was the first time he had truly investigated it specifically. Under his control, the nomological laws of the outside world penetrated every gap. It directly penetrated into the life essence of that creature and began to penetrate deeper layer by layer. He carefully probed all the structure of this life essence. The moment his senses penetrated into the life essence with the help of these nomological laws, Luo Fan suddenly felt that his senses seemed to have entered an incomparably mysterious world. This incomparably mysterious world was vast and boundless. Its structure was even more mysterious and marvelous. As far as the eye could see, the entire world had no top or bottom, no left or right, and even no earth or sky. There was only a vast expanse of fog. In this fog, there seemed to be endless power and information, and every point of this endless fog seemed to produce some kind of subtle fluctuation. These countless fluctuations superimposed and merged together, naturally turning into some kind of mysterious fluctuation that penetrated outside the life essence. After penetrating outside, this fluctuation stepped out of the body and began to sweep in all directions, continuously probing. During this process, all kinds of mysterious information were continuously transmitted back through the ripples and entered the essence of life. They started to react with the endless mist inside the essence of life, causing indescribable changes to the endless mist, which then changed the indescribable ripples and transmitted them out, and so on and so forth. The cycle repeated without end. It's actually such a complicated process. Looking at the amount of fog that probably exceeded the limit of what could be described with numbers, Luo Fan was secretly shocked. He originally thought that there would be some kind of mysterious organ structure appearing inside the life essence, allowing it to produce this kind of fluctuation. He didn't expect that the structure was actually such a discrete structure. Looking at the situation in front of him, in this endless fog, if any one of them was missing, the fluctuation would be instantly destroyed, unable to produce the fluctuation that could detect whether the outside world was a perfect world or not. However, this is also good. This way, as long as I have patience, I can understand the principle and then simulate it. It won't be like a fixed organ that needs more technology to break down to understand the principle. Such a thought flashed through Luofan's mind. However, this thought sounded more like he was comforting himself. After all, if it was originally just a strange organ, naturally, he could use it after taking it off. But now, he needed to completely understand the specific structure of all the fog and understand the fundamental principle to be able to use this fluctuation. The difference in the degree of difficulty between the two was self-evident. As for why he had to investigate before using it, instead of directly using the creature's body to investigate his own world, the reason was very simple. It was because he did not trust the creature. At the very least, he didn't trust this creature that he didn't understand at all. Not to mention other things, this creature seemed to be able to detect whether a certain law was a perfect world's law, but what about its accuracy? Was it really possible to make sure that there were no loopholes? Could it do it without the slightest error? Just like humans, when they used their 5 senses to determine what could be eaten and what couldn't be eaten, sometimes they would be poisoned by poisonous food, let alone this creature that didn't seem to have any intelligence.